A Story of the Sea by William Cowper Brann. Read for Love Stories Volume 1 by Michelle Fry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Story of the Sea. There have been mortals, favorites of the gods, to whom it was given to understand the language of the lower animals, and such I have ever envied, for beast and bird have seen and heard that which man knoweth not. Never could I get beyond an imperfect knowledge of their alphabet, enabling me to spell out here and there a word of little meaning. But the great ocean's never-ceasing speech was ever plain to me, and many a midnight hour I have paced the cool sands that girt my island home, and listened with reverential awe to the secrets it whispered to the sensuous southern breeze that kissed its bosom. Strange stories of wreck and wraith, wild wars and desperate deeds, mingled with those of love and honor, shame and sacrifice, crowding upon each other like specters in a dream. One night, when the new moon hung like a silver crescent pendant from Venus' flaming orb, in a summer sky thick inlaid with patines of pure gold, I heard the lazy waves breaking like slumberous thunder upon the long, low beach, and said, "The sea is calling me," and I went. Far out upon the long pier, where the waves could dash their spray like a shower of cool pearls in my face, I lingered long and listened to a story, sad and strange as a sweet-voiced woman telling in a foreign tongue, and punctuating with tears and sighs a tale of true love turned awry. Upon the beach they walked, in days that seemed to man long, long ago. How brief and strange the little lives of men, and so beset with customs framed to cramp the heart and curse the soul before its time. To me, here since time began to build that bridge of sighs and tears that link the two eternities, it seems but yesternight that hand in hand they wandered here, so wrapped in happiness, born of equal love, that they heeded not my glories spread forth to tempt their praise. I curled my snowy spray about their feet, flashed back the silver beams of harvest moon in one long shimmering sheet of mellow light, rolled waves of brilliant phosphorescence that seemed like silver billows, diamond-studded, breaking on a beach of gold, and sang the sweetest odes of the poets of 10,000 years. But they heard nor saw aught but the beating of their hearts in holy rhythm, and the love-light flaming like fires celestial in each other's eyes. Anon, bare-armed, bare-limbed, shamed yet happy, they sought the wave, and I cradled them on my bosom, and heard them whisper of laws defied, and cruel customs set at naught, and the higher law of love. But fearful she spoke and sighed, yet clung the closer to him, as though the earth and sea contained but one perfect model of a man, and that were he. Hour by hour they hovered near me, and 1,000 times she swore to him that their lives were so entwined that separation were death to her, and kissed his lips, his eyes, his hands, and wished she were his wife, that they might blazon to the great round world the love they fain would hide from heaven. One little year went by, and they came again, not walking hand in hand. He spoke to her, and she answered with bitter scorn. He touched with trembling lips upon the old days when love was lord of their two lives, but she mocked at love and him, and bade him leave her. Then he that was wont to rule first learned to sue, and vainly, for her heart was cold as the ashes of long-forgotten kings, cruel as wintry winds blown across icy northern seas. "It is a guilty love," she said, and he looked at her as if doubting that he heard, then turned and went like one that dreamed, for thought of wrong to her had dwelt not with him. He had but worshipped her as devout Sabaean might the sun and host of heaven. Again he came, but he was all alone. Long and lonely he paced the dreary beach beneath the wintry sky, until the cold mists seemed changed to mellow light, the stormy sky to one of summer, gemmed by myriad stars and queened by harvest moon. The cool wind sweeping o'er the barren waste to music and the merry laughter of men and maids, and she was by his side, her love-lit eyes making the blood dance through every vein. He put forth his hand to her, but the sky changed from gold to lead. The driftweed blew about his feet. The cold mist settled down upon him and crept with icy fingers into his heart. And he cursed the lying vision, the shrieking wind, the cold mist, and the leaden sky. Cursed the day that he first saw her, and said to waves that tumbled at his feet, "I must be mad. The curse of my race hath fallen upon me. Else why do I see that which is not, hear voices that are far away? Why do I cherish the image of a fickle woman who, swept along by a gust of passion or sickly sentiment, thought for a day she loved me, but did not, nor ever loved aught in life but her own selfish self?" And he called her name to the wind and waves, but coupled with it a curse, deep and bitter, as those that burst in sulphur breath from the parched lips of the damned, and a voice came back from out the gloom that seemed to mock him. Furious as a demon disturbed at some hellish rite, he turned and shrieked to the mocking voice, and bade it come to him, that he might wreak upon its owner such vengeance as would appall the world. The far lights shone like pale ghosts of lights through the driving mist, and in them loomed two weird forms that seemed 100 cubits high. Furious he rushed upon and smote them down upon the wet sand, and trampled them, and strove with feet and hands to kill. But they cried out for mercy on their lives, that they were honest fishermen who, hearing a cry but faintly above the roaring waves, had answered it, thinking some boatman might have met mishap and called for aid. The flood of anger spent in blows, he helped them up, wiped the blood and sand from their bronzed faces, gave them his scant purse, and bidding them drink a bumper, that hell fiends might drag him from the world before the morn sent them on their way. The gray dawn found him sleeping with his face upon the wet sand, once trodden by the feet that now trampled on his heart. Then I sent waves, cool and sweet, to kiss his cheek, and he awoke, and waking said, "Kisses for me? They are cold, great Mother Ocean, but not so cold as love burned out, leaving but the bitter ashes of contemptuous pity. I dreamed that I was afloat upon thy bosom with her I did so dearly love, and thou wast bearing us beneath a sunset sky to a fair island, fringed with palms and musical with songs of birds and rippling springs, where we two should live forever. That as we floated thus, love's goddess descended from a golden cloud, and opening the white bosom of my bride, yet not my bride, took thence her heart, and pressed from it a black drop, that fell upon the molten sea, and taking form became a hideous monster that cried, 'My name is Selfishness,' and vanished in the wave. Then, breathing upon the cold heart, ethereal flame that made it throb like a hero's pulse when trumpets are blown for war, she replaced it, healed the snowy globe with a touch, and smiling upon me, was caught into the golden cloud that seemed framed of music and the perfume of 1,000 flowers. A round arm stole about my neck, and we floated heart to heart on to the haven that was to be our heaven. A curse upon your briny waters that seem a world of bitter tears, rank with dead men's bones and the rotting hulls of ships. They have called me back to thy dreary, ever-moaning verge, to mock myself for loving one who scorns, for wasting my hot heart on a block of frozen stone, hoping by foolish prayers and unmanly tears to move the gods to breathe into it the breath of human life, to prevail even as did that old Greek who became enamored of a statue, less divinely formed, but with the self-same heart. 'Tis madness leads me to this folly, the old curse that hath hung about our house like a baleful shadow for thrice 100 years, bursting at times into bloody feuds without apparent cause, and dreadful mutinies against the laws of man and will of God. 'Tis vain to further fight with fate. 'Twill drag me down, even as it did my great-grandsire, who climbed fame's dizzy heights and stood poised in mid-heaven, the mastermind of Britain's mighty world. Then, like a tall mountain pine blasted at the top by the writhen bolts of God, plunged a falling star to the depths of everlasting darkness, and died a decade before his death. Nor iron will descended through my sire from a score of barbarous kings, nor mother's prayerful amulets, woven like golden threads through every low, sweet lullaby that soothed my infancy, can avail me aught. I can but fight and fall. She might have helped me beat back the shadows, but would not. And 'tis well. Then taking from a case a withered rose, he kissed it, cast it far out upon the wave, watched it dance there, and said with a bitter smile, "The last link that binds me to other days, and it is broken. The wage of sin is death, and I am dead these long months past, and fathoms deep in hell yet walk the earth, because nor land nor sea will yield a resting place among its honored dead to one so ignobly slain." End of A Story of the Sea by William Cowper Brand.
About Love by Anton Chekhov. Read for Love Stories Volume 1 by Kevin S. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. About Love, Anton Chekhov. At lunch next day there were very nice pies, crayfish, and mutton cutlets, and while we were eating, Nicanor the cook came up to ask what the visitors would like for dinner. He was a man of medium height, with a puffy face and little eyes. He was close-shaven, and it looked as though his mustaches had not been shaved but had been pulled out by the roots. Alian told us that the beautiful Pelagia was in love with this cook. As he drank and was of a violent character, she did not want to marry him, but was willing to live with him without. He was very devout, and his religious convictions would not allow him to live in sin. He insisted on her marrying him, and would consent to nothing else, and when he was drunk he used to abuse her and even beat her. Whenever he got drunk she used to hide upstairs and sob, and on such occasions Alian and the servants stayed in the house to be ready to defend her in case of necessity. We began talking about love. "How love is born," said Alian. "Why Pelagia does not love somebody more like herself in her spiritual and external qualities, and why she fell in love with Nicanor, that ugly snout, we all call him the Snout. How far questions of personal happiness are of consequence in love. All that is unknown. One can take what view one likes of it. So far only one incontestable truth has been uttered about love. This is a great mystery. Everything else that has been written or said about love is not a conclusion, but only a statement of questions which have remained unanswered. The explanation which would seem to fit one case does not apply in a dozen others, and the very best thing to my mind would be to explain every case individually without attempting to generalize. We ought, as the doctors say, to individualize each case." "Perfectly true," Birkin assented. "We Russians of the educated class have a partiality for these questions that remain unanswered. Love is usually poeticized, decorated with roses, nightingales. We Russians decorate our loves with these momentous questions, and select the most uninteresting of them, too. In Moscow, when I was a student, I had a friend who shared my life, a charming lady, and every time I took her in my arms she was thinking what I would allow her a month for housekeeping, and what was the price of beef a pound. In the same way, when we are in love, we are never tired of asking ourselves questions, whether it is honorable or dishonorable, sensible or stupid, what this love is leading up to, and so on. Whether it is a good thing or not, I don't know, but that it is in the way unsatisfactory and irritating, I do know." It looked as though he wanted to tell some story. People who lead a solitary existence always have something in their hearts which they are eager to talk about. In town, bachelors visit the baths and the restaurants on purpose to talk, and sometimes tell the most interesting things to bath attendants and waiters. In the country, as a rule, they unbosom themselves to their guests. Now, from the window we could see a gray sky, trees drenched in the rain. In such weather we could go nowhere, and there was nothing for us to do but to tell stories and to listen. "I have lived at Sofino and been farming for a long time," Alhin began, "ever since I left the university. I am an idle gentleman by education, a studious person by disposition. But there was a big debt owing on the estate when I came here, and as my father was in debt, partly because he had spent so much on my education, I resolved not to go away, but to work till I had paid off the debt. I made up my mind to do this and set to work, not, I must confess, without some repugnance. The land here does not yield much, and if one is not to farm at a loss, one must employ serf labor or hired laborers, which is almost the same thing, or put it on a peasant footing, that is, work the fields oneself and with one's family. There is no middle path. But in those days I did not go into such subtleties. I did not leave a clod of earth unturned. I gathered together all the peasants, men and women, from the neighboring villages. The work went on at a tremendous pace. I myself plowed and sowed and reaped, and was bored doing it, and frowned with disgust, like a village cat driven by hunger to eat cucumbers in the kitchen garden. My body ached, and I slept as I walked. At first it seemed to me that I could easily reconcile this life of toil with my cultured habits. To do so, I thought, all that is necessary is to maintain a certain external order in life. I established myself upstairs here in the best rooms, and ordered them to bring me there coffee and liqueur after lunch and dinner. And when I went to bed, I read every night the Vestnik Europi. But one day our priest, Father Ivan, came and drank up all my liquor at one sitting, and the Vestnik Europi went to the priest's daughters. As in the summer, especially at the haymaking, I did not succeed in getting to my bed at all, and slept in the sledge in the barn, or somewhere in the forester's lodge. What chance was there of reading? Little by little I moved downstairs, began dining in the servants' kitchen, and of my former luxury nothing is left but the servants who were in my father's service, and whom it would be painful to turn away. In the first years I was elected here an honorary justice of the peace. I used to have to go to the town and take part in the sessions of the Congress and of the Circuit Court, and this was a pleasant change for me. When you live here for 2 or 3 months without a break, especially in the winter, you begin at last to pine for a black coat. And in the Circuit Court there were frock coats and uniforms and dress coats too, all lawyers, men who have received a general education. I had someone to talk to. After sleeping in the sledge and dining in the kitchen, to sit in an armchair in clean linen, in thin boots with a chain on one's waistcoat, is such a luxury. I received a warm welcome in the town. I made friends eagerly. and of all my acquaintanceships the most intimate, and, to tell the truth, the most agreeable to me, was my acquaintance with Luganovich, the vice president of the circuit courts. You both know him, a most charming personality. It all happened just after a celebrated case of incendiarism. The preliminary investigation lasted 2 days. We were exhausted. Luganovich looked at me and said, "Look here, come round to dinner with me." This was unexpected, as I knew Luganovich very little, only officially, and I had never been to his house. I only just went to my hotel room to change, and went off to dinner. And here it was my lot to meet Anna Alexievna, Lukanovich's wife. At that time she was still very young, not more than 22, and her first baby had been born just 6 months before. It is all a thing of the past, and now I should find it difficult to define what there was so exceptional in her, what it was in her attracted me so much. At the time, at dinner, it was all perfectly clear to me. I saw a lovely, young, good, intelligent, fascinating woman, such as I had never met before, and I felt her at once someone close and already familiar, as though that face, those cordial, intelligent eyes, I had seen somewhere in my childhood, in the album which lay on my mother's chest of drawers. 4 Jews were charged with being incendiaries, were regarded as a gang of robbers, and, to my mind, quite groundlessly. At dinner I was very much excited. I was uncomfortable, and I don't know what I said, but Anna Alexievna kept shaking her head and saying to her husband, "Dmitri, how is this?" Luganovich is a good-natured man, one of those simple-hearted people who firmly maintain the opinion that once a man is charged before a court, he is guilty, and to express doubt of the correctness of a sentence cannot be done except in legal form on paper, and not at dinner and in private conversation. "You and I did not set fire to the place," he said softly, "and you see we are not condemned, and not put in prison." And both husband and wife tried to make me eat and drink as much as possible. From some trifling details, from the way they made the coffee together, for instance, and from the way they understood each other at half a word, I could gather that they lived in harmony and comfort, and that they were glad of a visitor. After dinner they played a duet on the piano. Then it got dark, and I went home. That was at the beginning of spring. After that I spent the whole summer at Sofina without a break, and I had no time to think of the town either, but the memory of the graceful, fair-haired woman remained in my mind all those days. I did not think of her, but it was as though her light shadow were lying on my heart. In the late autumn there was a theatrical performance for some charitable object in the town. I went into the governor's box. I was invited to go there in the interval. I looked, and there was Anna Alexievna sitting beside the governor's wife, and again the same irresistible, thrilling impression of beauty and sweet, caressing eyes, and again the same feeling of nearness. We sat side by side, then went to the foyer. "You've grown thinner," she said. "Have you been ill?" "Yes, I've had rheumatism in my shoulder, and in rainy weather I can't sleep." He looked dispirited. "In the spring, when you came to dinner, you were younger, more confident. You were full of eagerness, and talked a great deal then. You were very interesting, and I really must confess I was a little carried away by you. For some reason you often came back to my memory during the summer, and when I was getting ready for the theatre today I thought I should see you." And she laughed. "But you look dispirited today," she repeated. "It makes you seem older." The next day I lunched at the Luganoviches'. After lunch they drove out to their summer villa, in order to make arrangements there for the winter, and I went with them. I returned with them to the town, and at midnight drank tea with them in quiet domestic surroundings, while the fire glowed, and the young mother kept going to see if her baby girl was asleep. And after that, every time I went to town, I never failed to visit the Luganoviches'. They grew used to me, and I grew used to them. As a rule I went in unannounced, as though I were one of the family. "Who is there?" I would hear from a far-away room, in the drawling voice that seemed to me so lovely. "It is Pavel Konstantinovitch," answered the maid or the nurse. Anna Alexeyevna would come out to me with an anxious face, and would ask every time, "Why is it so long since you have been? Has anything happened?" Her eyes, the elegant, refined hand she gave me, her indoor dress, the way she did her hair, her voice, her step, always produced the same impression on me of something new and extraordinary in my life, and very important. We talked together for hours, were silent, thinking each our own thoughts, or she played for hours to me on the piano. If there were no one at home, I stayed and waited, talked to the nurse, played with the child, or lay on the sofa in the study and read. And when Anna Alexeyevna came back, I met her in the hall, took all her parcels from her, and for some reason I carried those parcels every time with as much love, with as much solemnity as a boy. There is a proverb that if a peasant woman has no trouble, she will buy a pig. The Luganoviches had no trouble, so they made friends with me. If I did not come to the town, I must be ill, or something must have happened to me, and both of them were extremely anxious. They were worried that I, an educated man with a knowledge of languages, should, instead of devoting myself to science or literary work, live in the country, rush round like a squirrel in a cage, work hard with never a penny to show for it. They fancied that I was unhappy, and that I only talked, laughed, and ate to conceal my sufferings, and even at cheerful moments, when I felt happy, I was aware of their searching eyes fixed upon me. They were particularly touching when I really was depressed, when I was being worried by some creditor, or had not money enough to pay interest on the proper day. The two of them, husband and wife, would whisper something at the window. Then he would come to me and say with a grave face, "If you really are in need of money at the moment, Pavel Konstantinovitch, my wife and I beg you not to hesitate to borrow from us." And he would blush to his ears with emotion, and it would happen that after whispering in the same way at the window, he would come up to me with red ears and say, "My wife and I earnestly beg you to accept this present." And he would give me studs, a cigar case, or a lamp, and I would send them game, butter, and flowers from the country. They both, by the way, had considerable means of their own. In early days I often borrowed money, and was not very particular about it. Borrowed wherever I could, but nothing in the world would have induced me to borrow from the Luganoviches. But why talk of it? I was unhappy. At home, in the fields, in the barn, I thought of her. I tried to understand the mystery of a beautiful, intelligent young woman's marrying someone so uninteresting, almost an old man. Her husband was over 40, and having children by him. To understand the mystery of this uninteresting, good, simple-hearted man, who argued with such wearisome good sense, at balls and evening parties, kept near the more solid people, looking listless and superfluous, with a submissive, uninterested expression, as though he had been brought there for sale, yet who believed in his right to be happy, to have children by her. And I kept trying to understand why she had met him first and not me, and why such a terrible mistake in our lives need have happened. And when I went to the town, I saw every time from her eyes that she was expecting me, and she would confess to me herself that she had a peculiar feeling all that day, and had guessed that I should come. We talked a long time, and were silent, yet we did not confess our love to each other, but timidly and jealously concealed it. We were afraid of everything that might reveal our secret to ourselves. I loved her tenderly, deeply, but I reflected and kept asking myself what our love could lead to if we had not the strength to fight against it. It seemed to be incredible that my gentle, sad love could all at once coarsely break up the even tenor of the life of her husband, her children, and all the household in which I was so loved and trusted. Would it be honorable? She would go away with me, but where? Where could I take her? Would have been a different matter if I had had a beautiful, interesting life, if, for instance, I had been struggling for the emancipation of my country, or had been a celebrated man of science, an artist or a painter. But as it was, it would mean taking her from one everyday humdrum life to another as humdrum, or perhaps more so. And how long would our happiness last? What would happen to her in case I was ill, in case I died, or if we simply grew cold to one another? And she apparently reasoned in the same way. She thought of her husband, her children, and of her mother, who loved the husband like a son. If she abandoned herself to her feelings, she would have to lie, or else to tell the truth, and in her position either would have been equally terrible and inconvenient. And she was tormented by the question whether her love would bring me happiness. Would she not complicate my life, which as it was hard enough and full of all sorts of trouble? She fancied she was not young enough for me, that she was not industrious nor energetic enough to begin a new life, and she often talked to her husband of the importance of my marrying a girl of intelligence and merit, who would be a capable housewife and a help to me. And she would immediately add that it would be difficult to find such a girl in the whole town. Meanwhile, the years were passing. Anna Alexievna already had 2 children. When I arrived at the Luganoviches, the servants smiled cordially. The children shouted that Uncle Pavel Konstantinovich had come and hung on my neck. Everyone was overjoyed. They did not understand what was passing in my soul, and thought that I too was happy. Everyone looked on me as a noble being, and grown-ups and children alike felt that a noble being was walking about the rooms, and that gave a peculiar charm to their manner towards me, as though in my presence their life too was purer and more beautiful. Anna Alexievna and I used to go to the theatre together, always walking there. We used to sit side by side in the stalls, our shoulders touching. I would take the opera glass from her hands without a word, and feel at that minute that she was near me, that she was mine, that we could not live without each other. But by some strange misunderstanding, when we came out of the theatre, we always said good-bye and parted as though we were strangers. Goodness knows what people were saying about us in the town already, but there was not a word of truth in it at all. In the latter years, Anna Alexievna took to going away for frequent visits to her mother or to her sister. She began to suffer from low spirits. She began to recognize that her life was spoilt and unsatisfied, and at times she did not care to see her husband nor her children. She was already being treated for neurasthenia. We were silent and still silent, and in the presence of outsiders she displayed a strange irritation in regard to me. Whatever I talked about, she disagreed with me, and if I had an argument, she sided with my opponent. If I dropped anything, she would say coldly, "I congratulate you." If I forgot to take the opera glass when we were going to the theatre, she would say afterwards, "I knew you would forget it." Luckily or unluckily, there is nothing in our lives that does not end sooner or later. The time of parting came as Luganovich was appointed president in one of the western provinces. They had to sell their furniture, their horses, their summer villa. When they drove out of the villa, and afterwards looked back as they were going away to look the last time at the garden, at the green roof, everyone was sad, and I realized that I had to say good-bye not only to the villa. It was arranged that at the end of August we should see Anna Alexievna off to the Crimea, where the doctors were sending her, and that a little later Luganovich and the children would set off for the western province. We were a great crowd to see Anna Alexievna off. When she had said good-bye to her husband and her children, and there was only a minute left before the 3rd bell, I ran into her compartment to put a basket, which she had almost forgotten, on the rack, and had to say good-bye. When our eyes met in the compartment, our spiritual fortitude deserted us both. I took her into my arms. She pressed her face to my breast, and tears flowed from her eyes. Kissing her face, her shoulders, her hands wet with tears. Oh, how unhappy we were! I confessed my love for her, and with a burning pain in my heart I realized how unnecessary, how petty, and how deceptive all that had hindered us from loving was. I understood that when you love, you must either, in your reasonings about that love, Start from what is highest, from what is more important than happiness or unhappiness, sin or virtue in their accepted meaning, or you must not reason at all. I kissed her for the last time, pressed her hand, and parted forever. The train had already started. I went into the next compartment. It was empty, and till I reached the next station I sat there, crying. Then I walked home to Sofino. While Alehin was telling his story, the rain left off and the sun came out. Burkin and Ivan Ivanovitch went out on the balcony, from which there was a beautiful view over the garden and the mill pond, which was shining now in the sunshine like a mirror. They admired it, and at the same time they were sorry that this man with the kind, clever eyes, who had told them this story with such genuine feeling, should be rushing round and round this huge estate like a squirrel on a wheel, instead of devoting himself to science or something else which would have made his life more pleasant. And they thought what a sorrowful face Anna Alexievna must have had when he said good-bye to her in the railway carriage, and kissed her face and shoulders. Both of them had met her in the town, and Burkin knew her and thought her beautiful. End of About Love by Anton Chekhov.
An Angel in Disguise by T.S. Arthur. Recorded for Love Stories Volume 1 by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. An Angel in Disguise. Idleness, vice, and intemperance had done their miserable work, and the dead mother lay cold and still amid her wretched children. She had fallen upon the threshold of her own door in a drunken fit, and died in the presence of her frightened little ones. Death touches the spring of our common humanity. This woman had been despised, scoffed at, and angrily denounced by nearly every man, woman, and child in the village. But now, as the fact of her death was passed from lip to lip in subdued tones, pity took the place of anger and sorrow of denunciation. Neighbors went hastily to the old tumble-down hut in which she had secured little more than a place of shelter from summer heats and winter cold. Some with grave clothes for a decent interment of the body, and some with food for the half-starving children, 3 in number. Of these, John, the eldest, a boy of 12, was a stout lad, able to earn his living with any farmer. Kate, between 10 and 11, was a bright, active girl, out of whom something clever might be made, if in good hands. But poor little Maggie, the youngest, was hopelessly diseased. 2 years before, a fall from a window had injured her spine, and she had not been able to leave her bed since, except when lifted in the arms of her mother. What is to be done with the children was the chief question now. The dead mother would go underground and be forever beyond all care or concern of the villagers, but the children must not be left to starve. After considering the matter and talking it over with his wife, Farmer Jones said that he would take John and do well by him, now that his mother was out of the way. And Mrs. Ellis, who had been looking out for a bound girl, concluded that it would be charitable in her to make choice of Katy, even though she was too young to be of much use for several years. "I could do much better, I know," said Mrs. Ellis, "but no one seems inclined to take her. I must act from a sense of duty, expect to have trouble with the child, for she's an undisciplined thing, used to having her own way." But no one said, "I'll take Maggie." Pitying glances were cast on her wan and wasted form, and thoughts were troubled on her account. Mothers brought cast-off garments, and removing her soiled and ragged clothes, dressed her in clean attire. The sad eyes and patient face of the little one touched many hearts, and even knocked at them for entrance. But no one opened to take her in. Who wanted a bedridden child? "Take her to the poorhouse," said a rough man, of whom the question, "What's to be done with Maggie?" was asked. "Nobody's going to be bothered with her." "The poorhouse is a sad place for a sick and helpless child," answered one. "For your child or mine," said the other, lightly speaking. "But for this brat it will prove a blessed change. She will be kept clean, have healthy food, and be doctored, which is more than can be said of her past condition." There was reason in that, but still it didn't satisfy. The day following the day of death was made the day of burial. A few neighbors were at the miserable hovel, but none followed the dead cart as it bore the unhonored remains to its pauper grave. Farmer Jones, after the coffin was taken out, placed John in his wagon and drove away, satisfied that he had done his part. Mrs. Ellis spoke to Kate with a hurried air. "Bid your sister good-bye," and drew the tearful children apart ere scarcely their lips had touched in a sobbing farewell. Hastily others went out, some glancing at Maggie, some resolutely refraining from a look until all had gone. She was alone. Just beyond the threshold, Joe Thompson, the wheelwright, paused and said to the blacksmith's wife, who was hastening off with the rest, "It's a cruel thing to leave her so." "Then take her to the poorhouse. She'll have to go there," answered the blacksmith's wife, springing away and leaving Joe behind. For a little while the man stood with a puzzled air. Then he turned back and went into the hovel again. Maggie, with painful effort, had raised herself to an upright position, and was sitting on the bed, straining her eyes upon the door, out of which all had just departed. A vague terror had come into her thin, white face. "Oh, Mr. Thompson!" she cried out, catching her suspended breath. "Don't leave me here all alone." Though rough in exterior, Joe Thompson, the wheelwright, had a heart, and it was very tender in some places. He liked children, and was pleased to have them come to his shop, where sleds and wagons were made or mended for the village lads without a draft on their hoarded sixpences. "No, dear," he answered in a kind voice, going to the bed and stooping down over the child, "you shan't be left here alone." Then he wrapped her with the gentleness almost of a woman in the clean bedclothes that some neighbor had brought, and, lifting her in his strong arms, bore her out into the air and across the field that lay between the hovel and his home. Now, Joe Thompson's wife, who happened to be childless, was not a woman of saintly temper, nor much given to self-denial for others' good, and Joe had well-grounded doubts touching the manner of greeting he should receive on his arrival. Mrs. Thompson saw him approaching from the window, and with ruffling feathers met him a few paces from the door as he opened the garden gate and came in. He bore a precious burden, and he felt it to be so. As his arms held the sick child to his breast, a sphere of tenderness went out from her and penetrated his feelings. A bond had already corded itself around them both, and love was springing to life. "What have you there?" sharply questioned Mrs. Thompson. Joe felt the child start and shrink against him. He did not reply except by a look that was pleading and cautionary, that said, "Wait a moment for explanations, and be gentle," and passing in, carried Maggie to the small chamber on the first floor and laid her on a bed. Then, stepping back, he shut the door and stood face to face with his vinegar-tempered wife in the passageway outside. "You haven't brought home that sick brat?" Anger and astonishment were in the tones of Mrs. Joe Thompson. Her face was in a flame. "I think women's hearts are sometimes very hard," said Joe. Usually Joe Thompson got out of his wife's way or kept rigidly silent and non-combative when she fired up on any subject. It was with some surprise, therefore, that she now encountered a firmly set countenance and a resolute pair of eyes. Women's hearts are not half so hard as men's. Joe saw by a quick intuition that his resolute bearing had impressed his wife, and he answered quickly and with real indignation, "Be that as it may, every woman at the funeral turned her eyes steadily from the sick child's face, and when the cart went off with her dead mother, hurried away and left her alone in that old hut with the sun not an hour in the sky." "Where were John and Kate?" asked Mrs. Thompson. Farmer Jones tossed John into his wagon and drove off. Katie went home with Mrs. Ellis, but nobody wanted the poor sick one. "Send her to the poorhouse," was the cry. "Well, why didn't you let her go then? What did you bring her here for?" "Oh, she can't walk to the poorhouse," said Joe. "Somebody's arms must carry her, and mine are strong enough for that task." "Then why didn't you keep on? Why did you stop here?" demanded the wife. "Because I'm not apt to go on fool's errands. The guardians must first be seen and a permit obtained." There was no gainsaying this. "When will you see the guardians?" was asked with irrepressible impatience. "Tomorrow." "Why put it off till tomorrow? Go at once for the permit and get the whole thing off of your hands tonight." "Jane," said the wheelwright with an impressiveness of tone that greatly subdued his wife, "I read in the Bible sometimes and find much said about little children, how the Savior rebuked the disciples who would not receive them, how he took them up in his arms and blessed them, and how he said that whosoever gave them even a cup of cold water should not go unrewarded. Now, it is a small thing for us to keep this poor, motherless little one for a single night, to be kind to her for a single night, to make her life comfortable for a single night." The voice of the strong, rough man shook, and he turned his head away so that the moisture in his eyes might not be seen. Mrs. Thompson did not answer, but a soft feeling crept into her heart. "Look at her kindly, Jane. Speak to her kindly," said Joe. "Think of her dead mother and the loneliness, the pain, the sorrow that must be on all her coming life." The softness of his heart gave unwonted eloquence to his lips. Mrs. Thompson did not reply, but presently turned toward the little chamber where her husband had deposited Maggie, and pushing open the door, went quietly in. Joe did not follow. He saw that her state had changed, and felt that it would be best to leave her alone with the child. So he went to his shop, which stood near the house, and worked until dusky evening released him from labor. A light shining through the little chamber windows was the first object that attracted Joe's attention on turning towards his house. It was a good omen. The path led him by this window, and when opposite, he could not help pausing to look in. It was now dark enough outside to screen him from observation. Maggie lay a little raised on the pillow with the lamp shining full on her face. Mrs. Thompson was sitting by the bed, talking to the child, but her back was toward the window, so that her countenance was not seen. From Maggie's face, therefore, Joe must read the character of their intercourse. He saw that her eyes were intently fixed upon his wife, that now and then a few words came as if in answers from her lips, that her expression was sad and tender. But he saw nothing of bitterness or pain. A deep-drawn breath was followed by one of relief, as if a weight lifted itself from his heart. On entering, Joe did not go immediately to the little chamber. His heavy tread about the kitchen brought his wife somewhat hurriedly from the room where she had been with Maggie. Joe thought it best not to refer to the child, nor to manifest any concern in regard to her. "How soon will supper be ready?" he asked. "Right soon," answered Mrs. Thompson, beginning to bustle about. There was no asperity in her voice. After washing from his hands and face the dust and soil of work, Joe left the kitchen and went to the little bedroom. A pair of large, bright eyes looked up at him from the snowy bed, looked at him tenderly, gratefully, pleadingly. How his heart swelled in his bosom! With what a quicker motion came the heartbeats! Joe sat down, and now, for the first time, examining the thin frame carefully under the lamplight, saw that it was an attractive face, and full of childish sweetness, which suffering had not been able to obliterate. "Your name is Maggie?" he said, as he sat down and took her soft little hand in his. "Yes, sir." Her voice struck a chord that quivered in a low strain of music. "Have you been sick long?" "Yes, sir." What a sweet patience was in her tone. "Has the doctor been to see you?" "He used to come." "But not lately?" "No, sir." "Have you any pain?" "Sometimes, but not now." "When had you pain?" "Well, this morning my side ached and my back hurt when you carried me." "It hurts you to be lifted or moved about?" "Yes, sir." "Your side doesn't ache now?" "No, sir." "Does it ache a great deal?" "Yes, sir, but it hasn't ached any since I've been on this soft bed." "Ah, the soft bed feels good." "Oh, yes, sir, so good." What a satisfaction mingled with gratitude was in her voice. "Supper is ready," said Mrs. Thompson, looking into the room a little while afterward. Joe glanced from his wife's face to that of Maggie. She understood him, and answered, "She can wait until we are done. Then I will bring her something to eat." There was an effort at indifference on the part of Mrs. Thompson, but her husband had seen her through the window, and understood that the coldness was assumed. Joe waited, after sitting down to the table, for his wife to introduce the subject uppermost in both of their thoughts, but she kept silent on that theme for many minutes, and he maintained a like reserve. But at last she said abruptly, "What are you going to do with that child?" "I thought you understood me, that she was to go to the poorhouse," replied Joe, as if surprised at her question. Mrs. Thompson looked rather strangely at her husband for some moments, and then dropped her eyes. The subject was not again referred to during the meal. At its close, Mrs. Thompson toasted a slice of bread and softened it with milk and butter. Adding to this a cup of tea, she took them into Maggie and held the small waiter on which she had placed them, while the hungry child ate with every sign of pleasure. "Is it good?" asked Mrs. Thompson, seeing with what a keen relish the food was taken. The child paused with the cup in her hand, and answered with a look of gratitude that awoke to new life old human feelings which had been slumbering in her heart for half a score of years. "We'll keep her a day or two longer. She is so weak and helpless," said Mrs. Joe Thompson, in answer to her husband's remark at breakfast time on the next morning, that he must step down and see the guardians of the poor about Maggie. "Oh, she'll be so much in your way," said Joe. "I shan't mind that for a day or two. Poor thing." Joe did not see the guardians of the poor on that day, on the next, nor on the day following. In fact, he never saw them at all on Maggie's account, for in less than a week Mrs. Joe Thompson would have soon thought of taking up her own abode in the almshouse, as sending Maggie there. What light and blessing did that sick and helpless child bring to the home of Joe Thompson, the poor wheelwright? It had been dark and cold and miserable there for a long time, just because his wife had nothing to love and care for out of herself, and so became sore, irritable, ill-tempered, and self-afflicting in the desolation of her woman's nature. Now the sweetness of that sick child, looking ever to her in love, patience, and gratitude, was as honey to her soul, and she carried her in her heart as well as in her arms, a precious burden. As for Joe Thompson, there is not a man in all the neighborhood who drank daily of a more precious wine of life than he. An angel had come into his house, disguised as a sick, helpless, and miserable child, and filled all its dreary chambers with the sunshine of love. End of An Angel in Disguise by T.S. Arthur.
HerLover by Maxim Gorky. Recorded for Love Stories Volume 1 by Nemo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. HerLover. An acquaintance of mine once told me the following story. When I was a student at Moscow, I happened to live alongside one of those ladies whose repute is questionable. She was a Pole, and they called her Teresa. She was a tallish, powerfully built brunette, with black bushy eyebrows and a large coarse face, as if carved out by a hatchet. The bestial gleam of her dark eyes, her thick bass voice, her cabman-like gait, and her immense muscular vigor, worthy of a fishwife, inspired me with horror. I lived on the top flight, and her garret was opposite to mine. I never left my door open when I knew her to be at home, but this, after all, was a very rare occurrence. Sometimes I chanced to meet her on the staircase or in the yard, and she would smile upon me with a smile which seemed to me to be sly and cynical. Occasionally I saw her drunk, with bleary eyes, tousled hair, and a particularly hideous grin. On such occasions she would speak to me. "How do you do, Mr. Student?" and her stupid laugh would still further intensify my loathing of her. I should have liked to have changed my quarters in order to have avoided such encounters and greetings, but my little chamber was a nice one, and there was such a wide view from the window, and it was always so quiet in the street below. So I endured. And one morning I was sprawling on my couch, trying to find some sort of excuse for not attending my class, when the door opened, and the bass voice of Teresa, the loathsome, resounded from my threshold. "Good health to you, Mr. Student." "What do you want?" I said. I saw that her face was confused and supplicatory. It was a very unusual sort of face for her. "Sir, I want to beg a favor of you. Will you grant it me?" I lay there silent, and thought to myself, "Gracious! Courage, my boy." "I want to send a letter home, that's what it is," she said. Her voice was beseeching, soft, timid. "Deuce take you," I thought. But up I jumped, sat down at my table, took a sheet of paper, and said, "Come here, sit down and dictate." She came, sat down very gingerly on a chair, and looked at me with a guilty look. "Well, to whom do you want to write?" "To Boleslaw Kashput, at the town of Svitskiana on the Warsaw Road." "Well, fire away." "My dear Boles, my darling, my faithful lover, may the Mother of God protect thee. Thou heart of gold, why hast thou not written for such a long time? To thy sorrowing little dove, Teresa. I very nearly burst out laughing. A sorrowing little dove, more than 5 feet high, with fist a stone and more in weight, and as black a face as if the little dove had lived all its life in a chimney, and had never once washed itself. Restraining myself somehow, I asked, "Who is this Bolest?" "Bowles, Mr. Student," she said, as if offended with me for blundering over the name. "He is Bowles, my young man." "Young man!" "Why are you so surprised, sir? Cannot I, a girl, have a young man?" She, a girl? Well! "Oh, why not?" I said. "All things are possible. And has he been your young man long?" 6 years. "Oh, ho!" I thought. "Well, let us write your letter." And I tell you plainly that I would willingly have changed places with this Bowles if his fair correspondent had been not Teresa, but something less than she. "I thank you most heartily, sir, for your kind services," said Teresa to me, with a curtsy. "Perhaps I can show you some service, eh?" "No, I most humbly thank you all the same." "Perhaps, sir, your shirts or your trousers may want a little mending?" I felt that this mastodon in petticoats had made me grow quite red with shame, and I told her pretty sharply that I had no need whatever of her services. She departed. A week or two passed away. It was evening. I was sitting at my window whistling and thinking of some expedient for enabling me to get away from myself. I was bored. The weather was dirty. I didn't want to go out, and out of sheer ennui I began a course of self-analysis and reflection. This also was dull enough work, but I didn't care about doing anything else. Then the door opened. Heaven be praised! Someone came in. "Oh, Mr. Student, you have no pressing business, I hope?" It was Teresa. "No, what is it?" "I was going to ask you, sir, to write me another letter." "Very well. To Bowles, eh?" "No, this time it is from him." "What?" Stupid that I am! It is not for me, Mr. Student. I beg your pardon. It is for a friend of mine. That is to say, not a friend, but an acquaintance. A man acquaintance. He has a sweetheart just like me here, Teresa. That's how it is. Will you, sir, write a letter to this Teresa?" I looked at her. Her face was troubled. Her fingers were trembling. I was a bit fogged at first, and then I guessed how it was. "Look here, my lady," I said. "There are no Boluses or Teresas at all, and you've been telling me a pack of lies. Don't you come sneaking about me any longer. I have no wish whatever to cultivate your acquaintance. Do you understand?" And suddenly she grew strangely terrified and distraught. She began to shift from foot to foot without moving from the place, and spluttered comically, as if she wanted to say something and couldn't. I waited to see what would come of all this, and I saw and felt that, apparently, I had made a great mistake in suspecting her of wishing to draw me from the path of righteousness. It was evidently something very different. "Mr. Student," she began, and suddenly, waving her hand, she turned abruptly towards the door and went out. I remained with a very unpleasant feeling in my mind. I listened. Her door was flung violently to. Plainly the poor wench was very angry. I thought it over, and resolved to go to her, and, inviting her to come in here, write everything she wanted. I entered her apartment. I looked round. She was sitting at the table, leaning on her elbows with her head in her hands. "Listen to me," I said. Now, whenever I come to this point in my story, I always feel horribly awkward and idiotic. Well, well. "Listen to me," I said. She leaped from her seat, came towards me with flashing eyes, and laying her hands on my shoulders, began to whisper, or rather to hum, in her peculiar bass voice. "Look you now, it's like this. There's no Bowles at all, And there's no Teresa either. But what's that to you? Is it a hard thing for you to draw your pen over paper? Ah? Ah? And you, too. Still such a little fair-haired boy. There's nobody at all. Neither Bowles nor Teresa. Only me. There you have it, and much good may it do you. Pardon me, said I, although flabbergasted by such a reception. What is it all about? There's no Bowles, you say? No, so it is. And no Teresa either? And no Teresa. I'm Teresa. I didn't understand it at all. I fixed my eyes upon her, and tried to make out which of us was taking leave of his or her senses. But she went again to the table, searched about for something, came back to me, and said in an offended tone, If it was so hard for you to write to Bowles, look, there's your letter, take it. Others will write for me. I looked. In her hand was my letter to Bowles. Phew! Listen, Teresa, what is the meaning of all this? Why must you get others to write for you when I have already written it, and you haven't sent it? Sent it where? Why, to this Bowles. There's no such person. I absolutely did not understand it. There was nothing for me but to spit and go. Then she explained. What is it? She said, still offended. There's no such person, I tell you. And she extended her arms as if she herself did not understand why there should be no such person. But I wanted him to be. Am I then not a human creature like the rest of them? Yes, yes, I know, of course. Yet no harm was done to anyone by my writing to him that I can see. Pardon me, to whom? To Bowles, of course. But he doesn't exist. Alas, alas! But what if he doesn't? He doesn't exist. But he might. I write to him, and it looks as if he did exist. And Teresa, that's me, and he replies to me, and then I write to him again. I understood at last, and I felt so sick, so miserable, so ashamed somehow. Alongside of me, not 3 yards away, lived a human creature who had nobody in the world to treat her kindly, affectionately, and this human being had invented a friend for herself. Look, now, you wrote me a letter to Bowles, and I gave it to someone else to read it to me, and when they read it to me, I listened and fancied that Bowles was there, and I asked you to write me a letter from Bowles to Teresa, that is to me. When they write such a letter for me and read it to me, I feel quite sure that Bowles is there, and life grows easier for me in consequence. Deuce take you for a blockhead, said I to myself when I heard this. And from thenceforth, regularly, twice a week, I wrote a letter to Bowles, and an answer from Bowles to Teresa. I wrote those answers well. She, of course, listened to them, and wept like anything, roared, I should say, with her bass voice. And in return for my thus moving her to tears by real letters from the imaginary Bowles, she began to mend the holes I had in my socks, shirts, and other articles of clothing. Subsequently, about 3 months after this history began, they put her in prison for something or other. No doubt by this time she is dead. My acquaintance shook the ash from his cigarette, looked pensively up at the sky, and thus concluded. Well, well, the more a human creature has tasted of bitter things, the more it hungers after the sweet things of life. And we, wrapped round in the rags of our virtues, and regarding others through the mist of our self-sufficiency, and persuaded of our universal impeccability, do not understand this. And the whole thing turns out pretty stupidly and very cruelly. The fallen classes, we say. And who are the fallen classes, I should like to know? They are, first of all, people with the same bones, flesh, and blood and nerves as ourselves. We have been told this day after day for ages, and we actually listen. And the devil only knows how hideous the whole thing is. or are we completely depraved by the loud sermonizing of humanism? In reality, we also are fallen folks, and, so far as I can see, very deeply fallen into the abyss of self-sufficiency and the conviction of our own superiority. But enough of this. It is all as old as the hills, so old that it is a shame to speak of it. Very old indeed, yes, that's what it is. End of HerLover by Maxim Gorky.
The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry, recorded for Love Stories Volume 1 by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gift of the Magi. $1.87. That was all. And 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied. 3 times Della counted it. $1.87. And the next day would be Christmas. There was clearly nothing to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl. So Della did it, which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sniffles predominating. While the mistress of the house is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second, take a look at the home. A furnished flat at $8 per week. It did not exactly beggar description, but it certainly had that word on the lookout for the mendicancy squad. In the vestibule below was a letter box into which no letter would go, and an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. Also appertaining thereunto was a card bearing the name Mr. James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity when its possessor was being paid $30 a week. Now, when the income was shrunk to $20, though they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest and unassuming D, but whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim, and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which is all very good. Della finished her cry and attended to her cheeks with the powder rag. She stood by the window and looked out dully at a gray cat walking a gray fence in a gray backyard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She had been saving every penny she could for months, with this result. $20 a week doesn't go far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. Well, they always are. Only $1.87 to buy a present for Jim. Her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him, something fine and rare and sterling, something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor of being owned by Jim. There was a pier glass between the windows of the room. Perhaps you have seen pier glass in an $8 flat. A very thin and very agile person may, by observing his reflection in a rapid sequence of longitudinal strips, obtain a fairly accurate conception of his looks. Della, being slender, had mastered the art. Suddenly she whirled from the window and stood before the glass. Her eyes were shining brilliantly, but her face had lost its color within 20 seconds. Rapidly she pulled down her hair and let it fall to its full length. Now there were 2 possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs in which they both took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the air shaft, Della would have let her hair hang down out the window some day to dry just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor, with all his treasures piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to see him pluck at his beard from envy. So now Della's beautiful hair fell about her, rippling and shining like a cascade of brown waters. It reached below her knees and made itself almost a garment for her. And then she did it up again, nervously and quickly. Once she faltered for a minute and stood still, while a tear or two splashed on the worn red carpet. On went her old brown jacket, on went her old brown hat, with a swirl of skirts and with the brilliant sparkle still in her eyes. She fluttered out the door and down the stairs to the street. Where she stopped, the sign read, Madame Sofroni, hair goods of all kinds. One flight up Della ran and collected herself, panting. Madame, large, too white, chilly, hardly looked the Sofroni. "Will you buy my hair?" asked Della. "I buy hair," said Madame. "Take your head off, and let's have a sight of the looks of it." Down rippled the brown cascade. $20, said Madame, lifting the mass with a practised hand. "Give it to me quick," said Della. Oh, and the next 2 hours tripped by on rosy wings. Forget the hashed metaphor. She was ransacking the stores for Jim's present. She found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores. She had turned all of them inside out. It was a platinum fob chain, simple and chaste in design, properly proclaiming its value by substance alone, and not by meretricious ornamentation, as all good things should do. It was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. It was like him, quietness and value. The description applied to both. $21 they took from her for it, and she hurried home with the 87 cents. With that chain on his watch, Jim might be properly anxious about the time in any company. Grand as the watch was, he sometimes looked at it on the sly on account of the old leather strap that he used in place of a chain. When Della reached home, her intoxication gave way a little to prudence and reason. She got out her curling irons and lighted the gas and went to work repairing the ravages made by generosity added to love, which is always a tremendous task, dear friends, a mammoth task. Within 40 minutes her head was covered with tiny, close-lying curls that made her look wonderfully like a truant schoolboy. She looked at her reflection in the mirror long, carefully, and critically. "If Jim doesn't kill me," she said to herself, "before he takes a second look at me, he'll say I look like a Coney Island chorus girl. But what could I do? Oh, what could I do with $1.87? At 7 o'clock the coffee was made, and the frying pan was on the back of the stove, hot and ready to cook the chops. Jim was never late. Della doubled the fob chain in her hand and sat on the corner of the table near the door that he always entered. Then she heard his step on the stair away down on the first flight, and she turned white for just a moment. She had a habit of saying a little silent prayer about the simplest everyday things. And now she whispered, "Please, God, make him think I am still pretty." The door opened, and Jim stepped in and closed it. He looked thin and very serious. Poor fellow, he was only 22, and to be burdened with a family. He needed a new overcoat, and he was without gloves. Jim stopped inside the door, as immovable as a setter on the scent of quail. His eyes were fixed upon Della, and there was an expression in them that she could not read, and it terrified her. It was not anger, nor surprise, nor disapproval, nor horror, nor any of the sentiments that she had been prepared for. He simply stared at her fixedly, with that peculiar expression on his face. Della wriggled off the table and went for him. "Jim, darling," she cried, "don't look at me that way. I had my hair cut off and sold because I couldn't have lived through Christmas without giving you a present. It'll grow out again. You won't mind, will you? I just had to do it. My hair grows awfully fast. Say Merry Christmas, Jim, and let's be happy. You don't know what a beautiful, nice gift I've got for you." "You've cut off your hair?" asked Jim laboriously, as if he had not arrived at that patent fact yet even after the hardest mental labor. "Cut it off and sold it," said Della. "Don't you like me just as well anyhow? I'm me without my hair, ain't I?" Jim looked about the room curiously. "You say your hair is gone?" he said, with an air almost of idiocy. "You needn't look for it," said Della. "It's sold, I tell you. Sold and gone, too. It's Christmas Eve, boy. Be good to me, for it went for you. Maybe the hairs of my head were numbered," she went on with a sudden serious sweetness, "but nobody could ever count my love for you. Shall I put the chops on, Jim?" Out of his trance, Jim seemed quickly to wake. He enfolded his Della. For 10 seconds let us regard with discreet scrutiny some inconsequential object in the other direction. $8 a week or $1 million a year. What is the difference? A mathematician or a wit could give you the wrong answer. The Magi brought valuable gifts, but that was not among them. This dark assertion will be illuminated later on. Jim drew a package from his overcoat pocket and threw it on the table. "Don't make any mistake, Della," he said, "about me. I don't think there's anything in the way of a haircut or a shave or shampoo that could make me like my girl any less. But if you'll unwrap that package, you may see why you had me going a while at first." White fingers and nimble tore at the string and paper, and then an ecstatic scream of joy, and then, alas, a quick feminine change to hysterical tears and wails, necessitating the immediate employment of all the comforting powers of the lord of the flat. For there lay the combs, a set of combs, side and back, that Della had worshipped long in the Broadway window. Beautiful combs, pure tortoise shell with jeweled rims, just the shade to wear in the beautiful vanished hair. They were expensive combs, she knew, and her heart had simply craved and yearned over them without the least hope of possession. And now they were hers, but the tresses that should have adorned the coveted adornments were gone. But she hugged them to her bosom, and at length she was able to look up with dim eyes and smile and say, "My hair grows so fast, Jim." And then Della leaped up like a little singed cat and cried, "Oh, oh!" Jim had not yet seen his beautiful present. She held it out to him eagerly upon her open palm. The dull, precious metal seemed to flash with a reflection of her bright and ardent spirit. "Isn't it dandy, Jim? I hunted all over town to find it. You'll have to look at the time 100 times a day now. Give me your watch. I want to see how it looks on it." Instead of obeying, Jim tumbled down on the couch and put his hands under the back of his head and smiled. "Dell," said he, "let's put our Christmas presents away and keep 'em a while. They're too nice to use just at present. I sold the watch to get the money to buy your combs. And now, suppose you put those chops on." The Magi, as you know, were wise men, wonderfully wise men, who brought gifts to the babe in the manger. They invented the art of giving Christmas presents. Being wise, their gifts were no doubt wise ones, possibly bearing the privilege of exchange in case of duplication. And here I have lamely related to you the uneventful chronicle of two foolish children in a flat who most unwisely sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house. But in a last word to the wise of these days, let it be said that of all who give gifts, these two were the wisest. Of all who give and receive gifts, such as they are wisest. Everywhere they are wisest. They are the Magi. End of The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry.
This is an excerpt from Don Rodriguez, Chronicles of Shadow Valley by Lord Dunsany. Recorded for Love Stories Volume 1 by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in August 2019. The 6th Chronicle, How He Sang to His Mandolin, and What Came of His Singing. To set the scene, I will read from the last few paragraphs of the 5th Chronicle. Don Rodriguez hit his horse. The tired animal went forward, and he and Moreno rode slowly up the street. Donna Serafina of the Valley of Dawnlight had left the heat of the room that looked on the fields, and into which the sun had all day been streaming, and had gone at sunset to sit in the balcony that looked along the street. Often she would do this at sunset, but she rather dreamed as she sat there than watched the street, for all that it had to show she knew without glancing. Evening after evening, as soon as winter was over, the neighbor would come from next door and stretch himself and yawn and sit on a chair by his doorway, and the neighbor from opposite would saunter across the way to him, and they would talk with eagerness of the sale of cattle, and sometimes, but more coldly, of the affairs of kings. She knew, but cared not to know, just when the two old men would begin their talk. She knew who owned every dog that stretched itself in the dust, until chilly winds blew in the dusk, and they rose up dissatisfied. She knew the affairs of that street like an old, old lesson taught drearily, and her thoughts went far away to vales of an imagination where they met with many another maiden fancy, and they all danced there together through the long twilight in spring. And then her mother would come and warn her that the evening grew cold, and Serafina would turn from the mystery of evening into the house and the candlelight. This was so, evening after evening, all through spring and summer for 2 long years of her youth. And then, this evening, just as the two old neighbors began to discuss whether or not the subjugation of the entire world by Spain would be for its benefit, just as one of the dogs in the road was rising slowly to shake itself, neighbors and dogs all raised their heads to look, and there was Rodriguez riding down the street, and Moreno coming behind him. When Serafina saw this, she brought her eyes back from dreams, for she dreamed not so deeply but that the cloak and plume of Rodriguez found some place upon the boundaries of her daydream. When she saw the way he sat in his horse, and how he carried his head, she let her eyes flash for a little moment along the street from her balcony. And if some critical reader asks how she did it, I answer, "My good sir, I can't tell you, because I don't know." Or, "My dear lady, what a question to ask! And where she learned to do it, I cannot think, but nothing was easier." And then she smiled to think that she had done the very thing that her mother had warned her there was danger in doing. "Serafina," her mother said in that moment at the large window, "the evening grows cold. It might be dangerous to stay there longer." And Serafina entered the house as she had done at the coming of dusk on many an evening. Rodriguez missed as much as that flash of her eyes shot from below the darkness of her hair, as youth in its first glory and freedom misses. For at the point on the road called life, at which Rodriguez was then, one is high on a crag, above the promontories of watchmen, lower only than the peaks of the prophets from which to see such things. Yet it did not need youth to notice Serafina. Beggars had blessed her for the poise of her head. She turned that head a little as she went between the windows, till Rodriguez, gazing up to her, saw the fair shape of her neck, and almost in that moment the last of daylight died. The windows shut, and Rodriguez rode on with Moreno to find the forge that was kept by Fernandez the smith. And presently they came to the village forge, a cottage with huge high roof, whose beams were safe from sparks, and its fire was glowing redly in the moonlight through the wide door made for horses, although there seemed no work to be done, and a man with a swart mustache was piling more logs on. Over the door was burned in oak, in ungainly great letters, Fernandez. "For whom do you seek, Señor?" he said to Rodriguez, who had halted before him with his horse's nose inside the doorway, sniffing. "I look," he said, "for him who is not Fernandez." "I am he," said the man by the fire. Rodriguez questioned no further, but dismounted and bade Moreno to lead the horses in. "Farewell," he said to the smith that was not Fernandez, and with a pat for his horse he left it, having obtained a promise of oats. And so Rodriguez and Moreno went on foot again, Moreno elated in spite of fatigue and pain, rejoicing to feel the earth once more flat under the soles of his feet, Rodriguez a little humbled. And now we move on to the 6th Chronicle, how he sang to his mandolin, and what came of his singing. They walked back slowly in silence, up the street down which they had ridden. Earth darkened, the moon grew brighter, and Rodriguez, gazing at the pale golden disk, began to wonder who dwelt in the lunar valleys, and what message, if folks were there, they had for our peoples, and in what language such message could ever be, and how it could fare across the limpid remoteness that wafted light on the coasts of earth and lapped in silence on the lunar shores. As he wandered, he thought of his mandolin. "Moreno," he said, "buy bacon." Moreno's eyes brightened, for they were 45 miles from the hills on which they had last tasted bacon. He selected his house with a glance, and then he was gone. And Rodriguez reflected too late that he had forgotten to tell Moreno where he should find him, and this with night coming on in the strange village. Scarcely, Rodriguez reflected, he knew where he was going himself. Yet if old tunes lurking in its hollows, echoing though imperceptibly from long-faded evenings, gave the mandolin any knowledge of human affairs that other inanimate things cannot possess, the mandolin knew. Let us in fancy call up the shade of Moreno from that far generation. Let us ask him where Rodriguez is going. Those blue eyes, dim with the distance over which our fancy has called them, look in our eyes with wonder. "I do not know," he says, "where Don Rodriguez is going. My master did not tell me." Did he notice nothing as they rode by the balcony? "Nothing," Moreno answers, "except my master riding." We may let Moreno's shade drift hence again, for we shall discover nothing, nor is this an age to which to call back spirits. Rodriguez strolled slowly on the deep dust of that street, as though wondering all the while where he should go, and soon he and his mandolin were below that very balcony, whereon he had seen the white neck of Serafina gleam with the last of daylight. And now the spells of the moon charmed earth with their full power. The balcony was empty. How should it have been otherwise? And yet Rodriguez grieved, for between the vision that had drawn his footsteps and that bare balcony below shuttered windows was the difference between a haven sought over leagues of sea and sheer uncharted cliff. It brought a wistfulness into the music he played, and a melancholy that was all new to Rodriguez. Yet often and often before had that mandolin sent up through evening, against unheeding space, that cry that man cannot utter, for the spirit of man needs a mandolin as a comrade to face the verdict of the chilly stars, as he needs a bulldog for more mundane things. Soon, out of the depth of that stout old mandolin, in which so many human sorrows had spun tunes out of themselves, as the spiders spin misty grey webs, till it was haunted with music, soon the old cry went up to the stars again, a thread of supplication spun of the matter which else were distilled in tears, beseeching it knew not what. And but that fate is deaf, all that man asks in music had been granted then. What sorrows had Rodriguez known in his life that he made so sad a melody? I know not. It was the mandolin. When the mandolin was made, it knew at once all the sorrows of man, and all the old unnamed longings that none defines. It knew them as a dog knows the alliance that its forefathers made with man. A mandolin weeps the tears that its master cannot shed, or utters the prayers that are deeper than its master's lips can draw, as a dog will fight for his master with teeth that are longer than man's. And if the moonlight streamed on untroubled, and though fate was deaf, yet beauty of those fresh strains, going starward from under his fingers, touched at least the heart of Rodriguez, and gilded his dreams, and gave to his thoughts a mournful autumnal glory, until he sang all newly as he never had sung before, with limpid voice along the edge of tears, a love song old as the woods of his father's valleys, at whose edge he had heard it once drift through the evening. And as he played and sang with his young soul in the music, he fancied, and why not, if they care aught for our souls in heaven, he fancied the angels putting their hands each one on a star and leaning out of heaven through the constellations to listen. "A vile song, signor, and a vile tune with it," said a voice quite close. However much the words hurt his pride in his mandolin, Rodriguez recognized in the voice a hidalgo's accent, and he knew that it was an equal that now approached him in the moonlight, round a corner of the house with the balcony, and he knew that the request he courteously made would be as courteously granted. "Senor," he said, "I pray you to permit me to lean my mandolin against the wall securely before we speak of my song." "Most surely, senor," the stranger replied, "for there is no fault with the mandolin." "Senor," Rodriguez said, "I thank you profoundly." And he bowed to the gallant, whom he now perceived to be young, a youth tall and lithe like himself, one whom we might have chosen for these chronicles had we not found Rodriguez. Then Rodriguez stepped back a short way and placed his kerchief on the ground, and upon this he put his mandolin and leaned it against the wall. When the mandolin was safe from dust or accident, he approached the stranger and drew his sword. "Senor," he said, "we will now discuss music." "Right gladly, senor," said the young man, who now drew his sword also. There were no clouds, the moon was full, the evening promised well. Scarcely had the flash of thin rapiers crossing each other by moonlight begun to gleam in the street, when Moreno appeared beside them and stood there watching. He had bought his bacon and gone straight to the house with the balcony, for though he knew no Latin, he had not missed the silent greeting that had welcomed his master to that village, or failed to interpret the gist of the words that Rodriguez's dumb glance would have said. He stood there watching while each combatant stood his ground. And Rodriguez remembered all those passes and feints that he had had from his father, and which Sebastiani, a master of arms in Madrid, had taught in his father's youth, and some were famous, and some were little known. And all these passes, as he tried them one by one, his unknown antagonist parried. And for a moment Rodriguez feared that Moreno would see those passes in which he trusted foiled by that unknown sword. And then he reflected that Moreno knew nothing of the craft of the rapier, and with more content at that thought he parried thrusts that were strange to him. But something told Moreno that in this fight the stranger was master, and that along that pale blue, moonlit, unknown sword lurked a sure death for Rodriguez. He moved from his place of vantage and was soon lost in large shadows, while the rapiers played and blade rippled on blade with a sound as though death were gently sharpening his scythe in the dark. And now Rodriguez was giving ground. Now his antagonist pressed him. Thrusts that he believed invincible had failed. Now he parried wearily and had at once to parry again. The unknown pressed on, was upon him, was scattering his weakening parries. Drew back his rapier for a deadlier pass, learned in a secret school, in a hut on mountains he knew and practiced surely, and fell in a heap upon Rodriguez's feet, struck full on the back of the head by Moreno's frying pan. "Most vile knave!" shouted Rodriguez as he saw Moreno before him with his frying pan in his hand, and with something of the stupid expression that you see on the face of a dog that has done some foolish thing which it thinks will delight its master. "Master, I am your servant," said Moreno. "Vile, miserable knave!" replied Rodriguez. "Master," Moreno said plaintively, "shall I see to your comforts, your food, and not to your life?" "Silence!" thundered Rodriguez as he stooped anxiously to his antagonist, who was not unconscious but only very giddy, and who now rose to his feet with the help of Rodriguez. "Alas, Signor," said Rodriguez, "the foul knave is my servant. He shall be flogged, he shall be flayed, his vile flesh shall be cut off him. Does the hurt pain you, Signor? Sit and rest while I beat the knave, and then we will continue our meeting." And he ran to his kerchief on which rested his mandolin, and laid it upon the dust for the stranger. "No, no," said he, "my head clears again. It is nothing." "But rest, Signor, rest," said Rodriguez. "It is always well to rest before an encounter. Rest while I punish the knave." And he led him to where the kerchief lay on the ground. "Let me see the hurt, Signor," he continued, and the stranger removed his plumed hat as Rodriguez compelled him to sit down. He straightened out the hat as he sat, and the hurt was shown to be of no great consequence. "The blessed saints be praised," Rodriguez said. "It need not stop our encounter. But rest a while, Signor." "Indeed, it is nothing," he answered. "But the indignity is immeasurable," sighed Rodriguez. "Would you care, Signor, when you are well rested, to give the chastisement yourself?" "As far as that goes," said the stranger, "I can chastise him now." "If you are fully recovered, Signor," Rodriguez said, "my own sword is at your disposal to beat him sore with the flat of it, or how you will. Thus no dishonor shall touch your sword from the skin of so vile a knave." The stranger smiled. The idea appealed to him. "You make a noble amend, Signor," he said as he bowed over Rodriguez's proffered sword. Moreno had not moved far off, but stood near, wondering. What should a servant do if not work for his master, he wondered, and how work for him when dead? And dead, as it seemed to Moreno, through his own fault, if he allowed any man to kill him when he perceived him about to do so. He stood there puzzled, and suddenly he saw the stranger coming angrily toward him in the clear moonlight with a sword. Moreno was frightened. As the hidalgo came up to him, he stretched out his left hand to seize Moreno by the shoulder. Up went the frying pan. The stranger parried, but against a stroke that no school taught or knew, and for the second time he went down in the dust with a reeling head. Rodriguez turned toward Moreno and said to him, "No, realism is all very well, and I know that my duty as author is to tell all that happened, and I could win mighty praise as a bold, unconventional writer. At the same time, some young lady will be reading all this next year in some far country, or in 20 years in England, and I would sooner she should not read what Rodriguez said. I do not, I trust, disappoint her. But the gist of it was that he should leave that place now and depart from his service forever. And hearing those words, Moreno turned mournfully away and was at once lost in the darkness, while Rodriguez ran once more to help his fallen antagonist. "Signor, Signor," he said with an emotion that some wearing centuries in cold climate have taught us not to show, and beyond those words he could find no more to say. "Giddy, only giddy," said the stranger. A tear fell on his forehead as Rodriguez helped him to his feet. "Señor," Rodriguez said fervently, "we will finish our encounter, come what may. The knave is gone, and—" "But I am somewhat giddy," said the other. "I will take off one of my shoes," said Rodriguez, leaving the other on. "It will equalize our unsteadiness, and you shall not be disappointed in our encounter. Come," he added kindly. "I cannot see clearly as before," the young hidalgo murmured. "I will bandage my right eye also," said Rodriguez, "and if this cannot equalize it—" "It is a most fair offer," said the young man. "I could not bear that you should be disappointed of our encounter," Rodriguez said. "By this spirit of hell that has got itself clothed in fat and dares to usurp the dignity of man." "It is a right fair offer," the young man said again. "Rest yourself, señor," said Rodriguez, "while I take off my shoe," and he indicated his kerchief, which was still on the ground. The stranger sat down a little wearily, and Rodriguez, sitting upon the dust, took off his left shoe. And now he began to think a little wistfully of the face that had shone from the balcony, where all was dark now in black shadows, unlit by the moon. The emptiness of the balcony and its darkness oppressed him, for he could scarcely hope to survive an encounter with that swordsman, whose skill he now recognized as being of a different class from his own, a class of which he knew nothing. All his own feints and passes were known, while those of his antagonist had been strange and new, and he might well have even others. The stranger's giddiness did not alter the situation, for Rodriguez knew that his handicap was fair and even generous. He believed he was near his grave, and could see no spark of light to banish that dark belief. Yet more chances than we can see often guard us on such occasions. The absence of Seraphina saddened him like a sorrowful sunset. Rodriguez rose and limped with his one shoe off to the stranger, who was sitting upon his kerchief. "I will bandage my right eye now, señor," he said. The young man rose and shook the dust from the kerchief and gave it to Rodriguez with a renewed expression of his gratitude at the fairness of the strange handicap. When Rodriguez had bandaged his eye, the stranger returned his sword to him, which he had held in his hand since his effort to beat Moreno, and drawing his own, stepped back a few paces from him. Rodriguez took one hopeless look at the balcony, saw it as empty and as black as ever. Then he faced his antagonist, waiting. "Bandage one eye, indeed," muttered Moreno, as he stepped up behind the stranger and knocked him down for the third time with a blow over the head from his frying pan. The young hidalgo dropped silently. Rodriguez uttered one scream of anger and rushed at Moreno with his sword. Moreno had already started to run, and knowing well that he was running for his life, he kept for a while the start that he had of the rapier. Rodriguez knew that no plump man of over 40 could last against his lithe speed long. He saw Moreno clearly before him, then lost sight of him for a moment and ran confidently on, pursuing. He ran on, and at last he recognized that Moreno had slipped into the darkness which lies always so near to the moonlight, and was not in front of him at all. So he returned to his fallen antagonist, and found him breathing heavily where he fell, scarcely conscious. The third stroke of the frying pan had done its work, surely. Rodriguez's fury died down only because it is difficult to feel two emotions at once. It died down as pity took its place, though every now and then it would suddenly flare and fall again. He returned his sword and lifted the young hidalgo and carried him to the door of the house under which they had fought. With one fist he beat on the door without putting the hurt man down, and continued to hit it until steps were heard and bolts began to grumble, as though disturbed too early from their rusty sleep in stone sockets. The door of the house with the balcony was opened by a servant, who, when he saw who it was that Rodriguez carried, fled into the house in alarm, as one who runs with bad news. He carried one candle, and when he had disappeared with the streaming flame, Rodriguez found himself in a long hall, lit by the moonlight only, which was looking in through the small contorted panes of the upper part of a high window. Alone with echoes and shadows, Rodriguez carried the hurt man through the hall, who was muttering now as he came back to consciousness. And as he went, there came to Rodriguez thoughts between wonder and hope, for he had had no thought at all when he beat on the door, except to get shelter and help for the hurt man. At the end of the hall they came to an open door that led into a chamber, partly shining with moonlight. "In there," said the man that he carried. Rodriguez carried him in and laid him on a long couch at the end of the room. Large pictures of men in the blackness out of the moon's rays frowned at Rodriguez mysteriously. He could not see their faces in the dark, but he somehow knew they frowned. Two portraits that were clear in the moonlight eyed him with absolute apathy. So cold a welcome from that house's past generations boded no good for him from those that dwelt there today. Rodriguez knew that in carrying the hurt man there he helped at a Christian deed, and yet there was no putting the merits of the case against the omens that crowded the chamber, lurking along the edge of the moonlight and darkness, disappearing and reappearing till the gloom was heavy with portent. The omens knew. In a weak voice and few words the hurt man thanked him, but the apathetic faces seemed to say, "What of it?" And the frowning faces that he could not see still filled the darkness with anger. And then from the end of the chamber, dressed in white and all shining with moonlight, came Seraphina. Rodriguez in awed silence watched her come. He saw her pass through the moonlight and grow dimmer, and glide to the moonlight again that streamed through another window. A great dim golden circle appeared at the far end of the chamber whence she had come, as the servant returned with his candle and held it high to give light for Donna Seraphina. But that one flame seemed to make the darkness only blacker, and for any cheerfulness it brought to the gloom, it had better never have challenged those masses of darkness at all in that high chamber. Among the brooding portraits it seemed trivial, ephemeral, modern, ill able to cope with the power of ancient things, dead days, and forgotten voices, which make their home in the darkness, because the days that have usurped them have stolen the light of the sun. And there the man stood, holding his candle high, and the rays of the moon became more magical still beside that little mundane flickering thing. And Seraphina was moving through the moonlight as though its rays were her sisters, which she met noiselessly and brightly upon some island, as it seemed to Rodriguez, beyond the coasts of earth. So quietly and so brightly did her slender figure move, and so aloof from him appeared her eyes. And there came on Rodriguez that feeling that some deride and that others explain away, the feeling of which romance is mainly made, and which is the aim and goal of all the earth. And his love for Seraphina seemed to him not only to be an event in his life, but to have some part in veiled and shadowy destinies, and to have the blessing of most distant days. Gray beards seemed to look out of graves in forgotten places to wag approval. Hands seemed to beckon to him out of far future times, where faces were smiling quietly, and dreaming on further still. This vast approval that gave benediction to his heart's youthful fancy seemed to widen and widen, like the gold of a summer's evening, or the humming of bees in summer in endless rows of limes, until it became a part of the story of man. Spring days of his earliest memory seemed to have their part in it, as well as wonderful evenings of days that were yet to be, till his love of Seraphina was one with the fate of the earth, and wandering far on their courses, he knew that the stars blessed it. But Seraphina went up to the man on the couch with no look for Rodriguez. With no look for Rodriguez, she bent over the stricken hidalgo. He raised himself a little on one elbow. "It is nothing," he said, "Seraphina." Still she bent over him. He laid his head down again, but now with open and undimmed eyes. She put her hand to his forehead. She spoke in a low voice to him. She lavished upon him sympathy for which Rodriguez would have offered his head to swords, and all, thought Rodriguez, for 3 blows from a knave's frying pan. And his anger against Moreno flared up again fiercely. Then there came another thought to him out of the shadows, where Seraphina was standing all white, a figure of solace. Who was this man who so mysteriously blended with the other unknown things that haunted the gloom of that chamber? Why had he fought him at night? What was he to Seraphina? Thoughts crowded up to him from the interior of the darkness, somber and foreboding as the shadows that nursed them. He stood there, never daring to speak to Seraphina, looking for permission to speak, such as a glance might give, and no glance came. And now, as though soothed by her beauty, the hurt man closed his eyes. Seraphina stood beside him, anxious and silent, gleaming in that dim place. The servant at the far end of the chamber still held his one candle high, as though some light of earth were needed against the fantastic moon, which, if unopposed, would give everything over to magic. Rodriguez stood there, scarcely breathing. All was silent. And then through the door by which Seraphina had come, past that lonely golden moon-defying candle, all down the long room across moonlight and blackness, came the lady of the house, Seraphina's mother. She came, as Seraphina came, straight toward the man on the couch, giving no look to Rodriguez, walking something as Seraphina walked, with the same poise, the same dignity, though the years had carried away from her the grace Seraphina had, so that, though you saw that they were mother and daughter, the elder lady called to mind the lovely things of earth, large gardens at evening, statues dim in the dusk, summer, and whatsoever binds us to earthly things. But Seraphina turned Rodriguez's thoughts to the twilight in which he first saw her, and he pictured her native place as far from here, in mellow fields near the moon, wherein she had walked on twilight, outlasting any we know, with all delicate things of our fancy, too fair for the rugged earth. As the lady approached the couch upon which the young man was lying, and still no look was turned toward Rodriguez, his young dreams fled as butterflies sailing high in the heat of June that are suddenly plunged in night by a total eclipse of the sun. He had never spoken to Seraphina or seen before her mother, and they did not know his name. He knew that he, Rodriguez, had no claim to a welcome. But his dreams had flocked so much about Seraphina's face, basking so much in her beauty, that they now fell back dying, and when a man's dreams die, what remains, if he lingers a while behind them? Rodriguez suddenly felt that his left shoe was off, and his right eye still bandaged, things that he had not noticed while his only thought was for the man he carried to shelter, but torturing his consciousness now that he thought of himself. He opened his lips to explain, but before words came to him, looking at the face of Seraphina's mother, standing now by the couch, he felt that, not knowing how, he had somehow wronged the penates of this house, or whatever was hid in the dimness of that long chamber, by carrying this young man there to rest from his hurt. Rodriguez's depression arose from these causes, but having arisen, it grew of its own might. He had had nothing to eat since morning, and in the favoring atmosphere of hunger, his depression grew gigantic. He opened his lips once more to say farewell, was oppressed by all manner of thoughts that held him dumb, and turned away in silence and left the house. Outside, he recovered his mandolin and his shoe. He was tired with the weariness of defeated dreams that slept in his spirit exhausted, rather than with any fatigue his young muscles had from the journey. He needed sleep. He looked at the shuttered houses, then at the soft dust of the road, in which dogs lay during the daylight. But the dust was near to his mood, so he lay down where he had fought the unknown hidalgo. A light wind wandered the street like a visitor come to the village out of a friendly valley, but Rodriguez's 4 days on the roads had made him familiar with all wandering things, and the breeze on his forehead troubled him not at all. Before it had wearied of wandering in the night, Rodriguez had fallen asleep. Just by the edge of sleep, upon which side he knew not, he heard the window of the balcony creak, and looked up wide awake all in a moment. But nothing stirred in the darkness of the balcony, and the window was fast shut. So whatever sound came from the window came not from its opening, but shutting. For a while he wondered, and then his tired thoughts rested, and that was sleep. A light rain woke Rodriguez, drizzling upon his face, the first light rain that had fallen in a romantic tale. Storms there had been, lashing oaks to terrific shapes, seen at night by flashes of lightning, through which villains rode abroad, or heroes sought shelter at midnight. Hurricanes there had been, flapping huge cloaks, fierce hail, and copious snow, but until now no drizzle. It was morning. Dawn was old and pale and gray and unhappy. The balcony above him, still empty, scarcely even held romance now. Rain dripped from it sadly. Its cheerless bareness seemed worse than the most sinister shadows of night. And then Rodriguez saw a rose lying on the ground beside him. And for all the dreams, fancies, and hopes that leaped up in Rodriguez's mind, rising and falling and fading, one thing alone he knew, and all the rest was mystery. The rose had lain there before the rain had fallen. Beneath the rose was white dust, while all around it the dust was turning gray with rain. Rodriguez tried to guess how long the rain had fallen. The rose may have lain beside him all night long, but the shadows of mystery receded no farther than this one fact, that the rose was there before the rain began. No sign of any kind came from the house. Rodriguez put the rose safe under his coat, wrapped in the kerchief that had guarded the mandolin, to carry it far from low light, through places familiar with roses and places strange to them, but it remained for him a thing of mystery until a day far from then. Sadly he left the house in the sad rain, marching away alone to look for his wars. End of the 6th Chronicle of the Chronicles of Don Rodriguez, How He Sang to His Mandolin and What Came of His Singing, by Lord Dunsany.
The Horse-Dealer's Daughter, by D.H. Lawrence. Recorded for Love Stories Volume 1 by Kevin S. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Horse-Dealer's Daughter. "Well, Mabel, and what are you going to do with yourself?" asked Joe with foolish flippancy. He felt quite safe himself. Without listening for an answer, he turned aside, worked a grain of tobacco to the tip of his tongue, and spit it out. He did not care about anything, since he felt safe himself. The three brothers and the sister sat round the desolate breakfast table, attempting some sort of desultory consultation. The morning's post had given the final tap to the family's fortunes, and all was over. The dreary dining-room itself, with its heavy mahogany furniture, looked as if it were waiting to be done away with. But the consultation amounted to nothing. There was a strange air of ineffectuality about the three men, as they sprawled at table, smoking and reflecting vaguely on their own condition. The girl was alone, rather short, sullen-looking young woman of 27. She did not share the same life as her brothers. She would have been good-looking, save for the impassive fixity of her face, bulldog, as her brothers called it. There was a confused tramping of horses' feet outside. The three men all sprawled round in their chairs to watch. Beyond the dark holly bushes that separated the strip of lawn from the highroad, they could see a cavalcade of Shire horses swinging out of their own yard, being taken for exercise. This was the last time. These were the last horses that would go through their hands. The young men watched with critical, callous look. They were all frightened at the collapse of their lives, and the sense of disaster in which they were involved left them no inner freedom. Yet they were 3 fine, well-set fellows enough. Joe, the eldest, was a man of 33, broad and handsome in a hot-flushed way. His face was red. He twisted his black mustache over a thick finger. His eyes were shallow and restless. He had a sensual way of uncovering his teeth when he laughed, and his bearing was stupid. Now he watched the horses with a glazed look of helplessness in his eyes, a certain stupor of downfall. The great draft horses swung past. They were tied head to tail, 4 of them, and they heaved along to where a lane branched off from the highroad, planting their great hoofs floutingly in the fine black mud, swinging their great rounded haunches sumptuously, and trotting a few sudden steps as they were led into the lane round the corner. Every movement showed a massive, slumberous strength and a stupidity which held them in subjection. The groom at the head looked back, jerking the leading rope, and the cavalcade moved out of sight up the lane. The tail of the last horse, bobbed up tight and stiff, held out taut from the swinging great haunches as they rocked behind the hedges in a motion like sleep. Joe watched with glazed, hopeless eyes. The horses were almost like his own body to him. He felt he was done for now. Luckily he was engaged to a woman as old as himself, and therefore her father, who was steward of a neighboring estate, would provide him with a job. He would marry and go into harness. His life was over. He would be a subject animal now. He turned uneasily aside, the retreating steps of the horses echoing in his ears. Then, with foolish restlessness, he reached for the scraps of bacon rind from the plates, and, making a faint whistling sound, flung them to the terrier that lay against the fender. He watched the dog swallow them, and waited till the creature looked into his eyes. Then a faint grin came on his face, and in a high, foolish voice he said, "You won't get much more bacon, shall you, you little B blank?" The dog faintly and dismally wagged its tail, then lowered his haunches, circled round, and lay down again. There was another helpless silence at the table. Joe sprawled uneasily in his seat, not willing to go till the family conclave was dissolved. Fred Henry, the second brother, was erect, clean-limbed, alert. He had watched the passing of the horses with more sang-froid. He was an animal like Joe. He was an animal which controls, not one which is controlled. He was master of any horse, and he carried himself with a well-tempered air of mastery. But he was not master of the situations of life. He pushed his coarse brown mustache upwards off his lip and glanced irritably at his sister, who sat impassive and inscrutable. "You'll go and stop with Lucy for a bit, shan't you?" he asked. The girl did not answer. "I don't see what else you can do," persisted Fred Henry. "Go as a skivvy," Joe interpolated laconically. The girl did not move a muscle. "If I was her, I should go in training for a nurse," said Malcolm, the youngest of them all. He was the baby of the family, a young man of 22, with a fresh, jaunty museau. But Mabel did not take any notice of him. They had talked at her and round her for so many years that she hardly heard them at all. The marble clock on the mantelpiece softly chimed the half-hour, and the dog rose uneasily from the hearthrug and looked at the party at the breakfast table. But still they sat on in ineffectual conclave. "Oh, all right," said Joe suddenly, apropos of nothing. "I'll get a move on." He pushed back his chair, straddled his knees with a downward jerk to get them free in horsey fashion, and went to the fire. Still he did not go out of the room. He was curious to know what the others would do or say. He began to charge his pipe, looking down at the dog, and saying in a high affected voice, Goin' with me, Arter. Thou'rt goin' further than the Count's on just now, dost hear?" The dog faintly wagged its tail. The man stuck out his jaw and covered his pipe with his hands and puffed intently. losing himself in the tobacco, looking down all the while at the dog with an absent brown eye. The dog looked up at him in mournful distrust. Joe stood with his knees stuck out, in real horsey fashion. "Have you had a letter from Lucy?" Fred Henry asked of his sister. "Last week," came the neutral reply. "And what does she say?" There was no answer. "Does she ask you to go and stop there?" persisted Fred Henry. "She says I can if I like." "Well, then, you'd better. Tell her you'll come on Monday." This was received in silence. "That's what you'll do, then, is it?" said Fred Henry, in some exasperation. But she made no answer. There was a silence of futility and irritation in the room. Malcolm grinned fatuously. "You'll have to make up your mind between now and next Wednesday," said Joe loudly, "or else find yourself lodgings on the curbstone." The face of the young woman darkened, but she sat on, immutable. "Here's Jack Ferguson!" exclaimed Malcolm, who was looking aimlessly out of the window. "Where?" exclaimed Joe loudly. "Just gone past." "Coming in?" Malcolm craned his neck to see the gate. "Yes," he said. There was a silence. Mabel sat on like one condemned at the head of the table. Then a whistle was heard from the kitchen. The dog got up and barked sharply. Joe opened the door and shouted, "Come on!" After a moment a young man entered. He was muffled up in overcoat and a purple woolen scarf, and his tweed cap, which he did not remove, was pulled down on his head. He was of medium height. His face was rather long and pale. His eyes looked tired. "Hello, Jack." "Well, Jack," exclaimed Malcolm and Joe. Fred Henry merely said, "Jack." "What's doing?" asked the newcomer, evidently addressing Fred Henry. "Same. We've got to be out by Wednesday. Got a cold?" "I have. Got it bad, too." "Why don't you stop in?" "Me stop in? When I can't stand on my legs, perhaps I shall have a chance." The young man spoke huskily. He had a slight Scotch accent. "It's a knockout, isn't it?" said Joe boisterously. "If a doctor goes round croaking with a cold, looks bad for the patients, doesn't it?" The young doctor looked at him slowly. "Anything the matter with you, then?" he asked sarcastically. "Not as I know of. Damn your eyes, I hope not. Why? I thought you were very concerned about the patients. Wondered if you might be one yourself." "Damn it, no. I've never been patient to no flaming doctor, and hope I never shall be," returned Joe. At this point Mabel rose from the table, and they all seemed to become aware of her existence. She began putting the dishes together. The young doctor looked at her, but did not address her. He had not greeted her. She went out of the room with the tray, her face impassive and unchanged. "When are you off, then, all of you?" asked the doctor. "I'm catching the 11:40, replied Malcolm. "Are you going down with the trap, Joe?" "Yes, I've told you I'm going down with the trap, haven't I?" "You'd better be getting her in, then." "So long, Jack, if I don't see you before I go," said Malcolm, shaking hands. He went out, followed by Joe, who seemed to have his tail between his legs. "Well, this is the devil's own," exclaimed the doctor, when he was left alone with Fred Henry. "Going before Wednesday, are you?" "That's the orders," replied the other. "Where? To Northampton?" "That's it." "The devil!" exclaimed Ferguson, with quiet chagrin, and there was silence between the two. "All settled up, are you?" asked Ferguson. "About." There was another pause. "Well, I shall miss you, Freddie boy," said the young doctor. "And I shall miss thee, Jack," returned the other. "Miss you like hell," mused the doctor. Fred Henry turned aside. There was nothing to say. Mabel came in again to finish clearing the table. "What are you going to do, then, Miss Pervin?" asked Ferguson. "Going to your sister's, are you?" Mabel looked at him with her steady, dangerous eyes, that always made him uncomfortable, unsettling his superficial ease. "No," she said. "Well, what in the name of fortune are you going to do? Say what you mean to do," cried Fred Henry with futile intensity. But she only averted her head and continued her work. She folded the white tablecloth and put on the chenille cloth. "The sulkiest bitch that ever trod," muttered her brother. but she finished her task with perfect impassive face, the young doctor watching her interestedly all the while. Then she went out. Fred Henry stared at her, clenching his lips, his blue eyes fixed in sharp antagonism, as he made a grimace of sour exasperation. "You could bray her into bits, and that's all you'd get out of her," he said in a small, narrowed tone. The doctor smiled faintly. "What's she going to do, then?" he asked. "Strike me if I know," returned the other. There was a pause. Then the doctor stirred. "I'll be seeing you tonight, shall I?" he said to his friend. "Aye. Where's it to be? Are we going over to Jesdale?" "I don't know. I've got such a cold on me. I'll come round to the Moon and Stars, anyway." "Let Lizzie and May miss their night for once, eh?" "That's it, if I feel as I do now." All's one. The two young men went through the passage and down to the back door together. The house was large, but it was servantless now, and desolate. At the back was a small bricked house yard, and beyond that a big square, gravelled, fine and red, and having stables on two sides. Sloping, dank, winter-dark fields stretched away on the open sides. But the stables were empty. Joseph Purvin, the father of the family, had been a man of no education, who had become a fairly large horse dealer. The stables had been full of horses. There was great turmoil and come and go of horses and of dealers and grooms. Then the kitchen was full of servants. But of late things had declined. The old man had married a second time, to retrieve his fortunes. Now he was dead, and everything was gone to the dogs. There was nothing but debt and threatening. For months Mabel had been servantless in the big house, keeping the home together in penury for her ineffectual brothers. She had kept house for 10 years, but previously it was with unstinted means. Then, however brutal and coarse everything was, the sense of money had kept her proud, confident. The men might be foul-mouthed, the women in the kitchen might have bad reputations, her brothers might have illegitimate children, but so long as there was money, the girl felt herself established and brutally proud, reserved. No company came to the house, save dealers and coarse men. Mabel had no associates of her own sex after her sister went away. But she did not mind. She went regularly to church, she attended to her father, and she lived in the memory of her mother, who had died when she was 14, and whom she had loved. She had loved her father, too, in a different way, depending upon him and feeling secure in him, until at the age of 54 he married again. And then she had set hard against him. Now he had died and left them all hopelessly in debt. She had suffered badly during the period of poverty. Nothing, however, could shake the curious, sullen, animal pride that dominated each member of the family. Now, for Mabel, the end had come. Still, she would not cast about her. She would follow her own way just the same. She would always hold the keys of her own situation. Mindless and persistent, she endured from day to day. Why should she think? Why should she answer to anybody? It was enough that this was the end, and there was no way out. She need not pass any more darkly along the main street of the small town, avoiding every eye. She need not demean herself any more, going into the shops and buying the cheapest food. This was at an end. She thought of nobody, not even of herself. Mindless and persistent, she seemed in a sort of ecstasy to be coming nearer to her fulfillment, her own glorification, approaching her dead mother, who was glorified. In the afternoon she took a little bag with shears and sponge and a small scrubbing brush and went out. It was a gray, wintry day with satin dark green fields and an atmosphere blackened by the smoke of foundries not far off. She went quickly, darkly along the causeway, heeding nobody, through the town to the churchyard. There she always felt secure, as if no one could see her, although as a matter of fact she was exposed to the stare of everyone who passed along under the churchyard wall. Nevertheless, once under the shadow of the great looming church, among the graves, she felt immune from the world, reserved within the thick churchyard wall as in another country. Carefully she clipped the grass from the grave and arranged the pinky-white small chrysanthemums in the tin cross. When this was done, she took an empty jar from a neighboring grave, brought water, and carefully, most scrupulously, sponged the marble headstone and the coping stone. It gave her sincere satisfaction to do this. She felt in immediate contact with the world of her mother. She took minute pains, went through the park in a state bordering on pure happiness, as if in performing this task she came into a subtle, intimate connection with her mother, for the life she followed here in the world was far less real than the world of death she inherited from her mother. The doctor's house was just by the church. Ferguson, being a mere hired assistant, was slave to the countryside. As he hurried now to attend to the outpatients in the surgery, glancing across the graveyard with his quick eyes, he saw the girl at her task at the grave. She seemed so intent and remote. It's like looking into another world. Some mystical element was touched in him. He slowed down as he walked, watching her as if spellbound. She lifted her eyes, feeling him looking. Their eyes met, and each looked again at once, each feeling in some way found out by the other. He lifted his cap and passed on down the road. There remained distinct in his consciousness, like a vision, the memory of her face, lifted from the tombstone in the churchyard, and looking at him with slow, large, portentous eyes. It was portentous, her face. It seemed to mesmerize him. There was a heavy power in her eyes which laid hold of his whole being, as if he had drunk some powerful drug. He had been feeling weak and done before. Now the life came back into him. He felt delivered from his own fretted daily self. He finished his duties at the surgery as quickly as might be, hastily filling up the bottles of the waiting people with cheap drugs. Then in perpetual haste he set off again to visit several cases in another part of his round before tea time. At all times he preferred to walk, if he could, but particularly when he was not well. He fancied the motion restored him. The afternoon was falling. It was gray, deadened, and wintry, with a slow, moist, heavy coldness sinking in and deadening all the faculties. But why should he think or notice? He hastily climbed the hill and turned across the dark green fields, following the black cinder track. In the distance, across the shallow dip in the country, the small town was clustered like smoldering ash, a tower, a spire, a heap of low, raw, extinct houses. And on the nearest fringe of the town, sloping into the dip, was Old Meadow, the Pervins' house. He could see the stables and the outbuildings distinctly as they lay toward him on the slope. Well, he would not go there many more times. Another resource would be lost to him, another place gone. The only company he cared for in this alien, ugly little town he was losing. Nothing but work, drudgery, constant hastening from dwelling to dwelling among the colliers and the iron workers. It wore him out, but at the same time he had a craving for it. It was a stimulant to him to be in the homes of the working people, moving, as it were, through the innermost body of their life. His nerves were excited and gratified. He could come so near into the very lives of the rough, inarticulate, powerfully emotional men and women. He grumbled and said he hated the hellish hole, but as a matter of fact it excited him. The contact with the rough, strongly feeling people was a stimulant applied direct to his nerves. Below Old Meadow, in the green, shallow, sodden hollow of fields, lay a square, deep pond. Roving across the landscape, the doctor's quick eye detected a figure in black passing through the gate of the field, down towards the pond. He looked again. It would be Mabel Pervin. His mind suddenly became alive and attentive. Why was she going down there? He pulled up on the path on the slope above and stood staring. He could just make sure of the small black figure moving in the hollow of the failing day. He seemed to see her in the midst of such obscurity that he was like a clairvoyant, seeing rather with the mind's eye than with ordinary sight. Yet he could see her positively enough, whilst he kept his eye attentive. He felt, if he looked away from her in the thick, ugly, failing dusk, he would lose her altogether. He followed her minutely as she moved, direct and intent, like something transmitted rather than stirring involuntary activity, straight down the field towards the pond. There she stood on the bank for a moment. She never raised her head. Then she waded slowly into the water. He stood motionless as the small black figure walked slowly and deliberately toward the center of the pond, very slowly, gradually, moving deeper into the motionless water, and still moving forward as the water got up to her breasts. Then he could see her no more in the dusk of the dead afternoon. "There!" he exclaimed. "Would you believe it?" And he hastened straight down, running over the wet, sodden fields, pushing through the hedges, down into the depression of callous, wintry obscurity. It took him several minutes to come to the pond. He stood on the bank, breathing heavily. He could see nothing. His eyes seemed to penetrate the dead water. Yes, perhaps that was the dark shadow of her black clothing beneath the surface of the water. He slowly ventured into the pond. The bottom was deep, soft clay. He sank in, and the water clasped dead cold round his legs. As he stirred, he could smell the cold, rotten clay that fouled up into the water. It was objectionable in his lungs. Still repelled and yet not heeding, he moved deeper into the pond. The cold water rose above his thighs, over his loins, upon his abdomen. The lower part of his body was all sunk in the hideous cold element, and the bottom was so deeply soft and uncertain. He was afraid of pitching with his mouth underneath. He could not swim, and was afraid. He crouched a little, spreading his hands under the waters and moving them round, trying to feel for her. The dead cold pond swayed upon his chest. He moved again, a little deeper, and again, with his hands underneath. He felt all around under the water, and he touched her clothing, but it evaded his fingers. He made a desperate effort to grasp it. In so doing, he lost his balance and went under, horribly, suffocating in the foul, earthy water, struggling madly for a few moments. At last, after what seemed an eternity, he got his footing, rose again into the air, and looked around. He gasped and knew he was in the world. Then he looked at the water. She had risen near him. He grasped her clothing, and drawing her nearer, turned to take his way to land again. He went very slowly, carefully, absorbed in the slow progress. He rose higher, climbing out of the pond. The water was now only about his legs. He was thankful, full of relief to be out of the clutches of the pond. He lifted her and staggered onto the bank, out of the horror of wet gray clay. He laid her down on the bank. She was quite unconscious and running with water. He made the water come from her mouth. He worked to restore her. He did not have to work very long before he could feel the breathing begin again in her. She was breathing naturally. He worked a little longer. He could feel her live beneath his hands. She was coming back. He wiped her face, wrapped her in his overcoat, looked round in the dim, dark gray world, then lifted her and staggered down the bank and across the fields. It seemed an unthinkable long way, and his burden so heavy he felt he would never get to the house. But at last he was in the stable yard, and then in the house yard. He opened the door and went into the house. In the kitchen he laid her down on the hearthrug and called. The house was empty, but the fire was burning in the grate. Then again he kneeled to attend to her. She was breathing. Her eyes were wide open and as if conscious, but there seemed something missing in her look. She was conscious in herself, but unconscious of her surroundings. He ran upstairs, took blankets from a bed, and put them before the fire to warm. Then he removed her saturated, earth-smelling clothing, rubbed her dry with a towel, and wrapped her naked in the blankets. Then he went into the dining room to look for spirits. There was a little whiskey. He drank a gulp himself and put some into her mouth. The effect was instantaneous. She looked full into his face, as if she had seen him for some time, and yet had only just become conscious of him. "Dr. Ferguson?" she said. "What?" he answered. He was divesting himself of his coat, intending to find some dry clothing upstairs. He could not bear the smell of the dead, clayey water, and he was mortally afraid for his own health. "What did I do?" she asked. "Walked into the pond," he replied. He had begun to shudder like one sick, and could hardly attend to her. Her eyes remained full on him. He seemed to be going dark in his mind, looking back at her helplessly. The shuddering became quieter in him. His life came back to him, dark and unknowing, but strong again. "Was I out of my mind?" she asked, while her eyes were fixed on him all the time. "Maybe." For the moment, he replied, he felt quiet because his strength had come back. The strange, fretful strain had left him. "Am I out of my mind now?" she asked. "Are you?" He reflected a moment. "No," he answered truthfully, "I don't see that you are." He turned his face aside. He was afraid now, because he felt dazed and felt dimly that her power was stronger than his in this issue. And she continued to look at him fixedly all the time. "Can you tell me where I shall find some dry things to put on?" he asked. "Did you dive into the pond for me?" she asked. "No," he answered. "I walked in, but I went in overhead as well." There was silence for a moment. He hesitated. He very much wanted to go upstairs to get into dry clothing, but there was another desire in him, and she seemed to hold him. His will seemed to have gone to sleep and left him, standing there slack before her. But he felt warm inside himself. He did not shudder at all, though his clothes were sodden on him. "Why did you?" she asked. "Because I didn't want you to do a foolish thing," he said. "It wasn't foolish," she said, still gazing at him as she lay on the floor with a sofa cushion under her head. "It was the right thing to do. I knew best then. I'll go and shift these wet things," he said. But still he had not the power to move out of her presence until she sent him. It was as if she had the life of his body in her hands, and he could not extricate himself. But perhaps he did not want to. Suddenly she sat up. Then she became aware of her own immediate condition. She felt the blankets about her. She knew her own limbs. For a moment it seemed as if her reason were going. She looked round with wild eye, as if seeking something. He stood still with fear. She saw her clothing lying scattered. "Who undressed me?" she asked, her eyes resting full and inevitable on his face. "I did," he replied, "to bring you round." For some moments she sat and gazed at him awfully. Her lips parted. "Do you love me, then?" she asked. He only stood and stared at her, fascinated. His soul seemed to melt. She shuffled forward on her knees and put her arms round him, round his legs as he stood there, pressing her breasts against his knees and thighs, clutching him with strange, convulsive certainty, pressing his thighs against her, drawing him to her face, her throat, as she looked up at him with flaring, humble eyes of transfiguration, triumphant in first possession. "You love me," she murmured, in strange transport, yearning and triumphant and confident. "You love me. I know you love me. I know." And she was passionately kissing his knees through the wet clothing, passionately and indiscriminately kissing his knees, his legs, as if unaware of everything. He looked down at the tangled wet hair, the wild, bare animal shoulders. He was amazed, bewildered, and afraid. He had never thought of loving her. He had never wanted to love her. When he rescued her and restored her, he was a doctor, and she was a patient. He had no single personal thought of her. Nay, this introduction of the personal element was very distasteful to him, a violation of his professional honor. It was horrible to have her there, embracing his knees. It was horrible. He revolted from it violently, and yet he had not the power to break away. She looked at him again with the same supplication of powerful love, and that same transcendent, frightening light of triumph. In view of the delicate flame which seemed to come from her face like a light, he was powerless, and yet he had never intended to love her. He had never intended, and something stubborn in him could not give way. "You love me," she repeated, in a murmur of deep rhapsodic assurance, "You love me." Her hands were drawing him down to her. He was afraid, even a little horrified, for he had really no intention of loving her. Yet her hands were drawing him toward her. He put out his hand quickly to steady himself, and grasp her bare shoulder. A flame seemed to burn the hand that grasped her soft shoulder. He had no intention of loving her. His whole will was against his yielding. It was horrible, and yet wonderful was the touch of her shoulders, beautiful the shining of her face. Was she perhaps mad? He had a horror of yielding to her, yet something in him ached also. He had been staring away at the door, away from her, but his hand remained on her shoulder. She had gone suddenly very still. He looked down at her. Her eyes were now wide with fear, with doubt. The light was dying from her face. A shadow of terrible grayness was returning. He could not bear the touch of her eyes' question upon him, and the look of death behind the question. With an inward groan he gave way, and let his heart yield towards her. A sudden gentle smile came on his face, and her eyes, which never left his face, slowly filled with tears. He watched the strange water rise in her eyes, like some slow fountain coming up, and his heart seemed to burn and melt away in his breast. He could not bear to look at her any more. He dropped on his knees and caught her head with his arms and pressed her face against his throat. She was very still. His heart, which seemed to have broken, was burning with a kind of agony in his breast, and he felt her slow hot tears wetting his throat, but he could not move. He felt the hot tears wet his neck and the hollows of his neck, and he remained motionless, suspended through one of man's eternities. Only now it had become indispensable to him to have her face pressed close to him. He could never let her go again. He could never let her head go away from the close clutch of his arm. He wanted to remain like that forever, with his heart hurting him in a pain that was also life to him. Without knowing, he was looking down on her damp, soft brown hair. Then, as if it were suddenly, he smelt the horrid stagnant smell of that water, and at the same moment she drew away from him and looked at him. Her eyes were wistful and unfathomable. He was afraid of them, and he fell to kissing her, not knowing what he was doing. He wanted her eyes not to have that terrible, wistful, unfathomable look. When she turned her face to him again, a faint, delicate flush was glowing, and there was again dawning that terrible shining of joy in her eyes, which really terrified him, and yet which he now wanted to see, because he feared the look of doubt still more. "You love me," she said, rather faltering. "Yes." The word cost him a painful effort, not because it wasn't true, but because it was too newly true. The saying seemed to tear open again his newly torn heart, and he hardly wanted it to be true, even now. She lifted her face to him, and he bent forward and kissed her on the mouth, gently, with the one kiss that is an eternal pledge. And as he kissed her, his heart strained again in his breast. He never intended to love her. But now it was over. He had crossed over the gulf to her, and all that he had left behind had shriveled and become void. After the kiss, her eyes again slowly filled with tears. She sat still, away from him, with her face drooped aside and her hands folded in her lap. The tears fell very slowly. There was complete silence. He too sat there motionless and silent on the hearthrug. The strange pain of his heart that was broken seemed to consume him, that he should love her, that this was love, that he should be ripped open in this way. Him, a doctor! How they would all jeer if they knew. It was agony to him to think they might know. In the curious naked pain of the thought, he looked again to her. She was sitting there, drooped into a muse. He saw a tear fall, and his heart flared hot. He saw for the first time that one of her shoulders was quite uncovered, one arm bare. He could see one of her small breasts dimly because it had become almost dark in the room. "Why are you crying?" he asked in an altered voice. She looked up at him, and behind her tears the consciousness of her situation for the first time brought a dark look of shame to her eyes. "I'm not crying, really," she said, watching him half frightened. He reached his hand and softly closed it on her bare arm. "I love you. I love you," he said in a soft, low, vibrating voice, unlike himself. She shrank and dropped her head. The soft, penetrating grip of his hand on her arm distressed her. She looked up at him. "I want to go," she said. "I want to go and get you some dry things." "Why?" he said. "I'm all right." "But I want to go," she said, "and I want you to change your things." He released her arm, and she wrapped herself in the blanket, looking at him rather frightened, and still she did not rise. "Kiss me," she said wistfully. He kissed her, but briefly, half in anger. Then after a second she rose nervously, all mixed up in the blanket. He watched her in her confusion as she tried to extricate herself and wrap herself up so that she could walk. He watched her relentlessly, as she knew, and as she went, the blanket trailing, and as he saw a glimpse of her feet and her white leg, he tried to remember her as she was when he had wrapped her in the blanket. But then he didn't want to remember, because she had been nothing to him then, and his nature revolted from remembering her as she was when she was nothing to him. A tumbling, muffled noise from within the dark house startled him. Then he heard her voice. "There are clothes." He rose and went to the foot of the stairs and gathered up the garments she had thrown down. Then he came back to the fire to rub himself down and dress. He grinned at his own appearance when he had finished. The fire was sinking, so he put on coal. The house was now quite dark, save for the light of a street lamp that shone in faintly from beyond the holly trees. He lit the gas with matches he found on the mantelpiece. Then he emptied the pockets of his own clothes and threw all his wet things in a heap into the scullery, after which he gathered up her sodden clothes gently and put them in a separate heap on the copper top in the scullery. It was 6 o'clock on the clock. His own watch had stopped. He ought to go back to the surgery. He waited, and still she did not come down. So he went to the foot of the stairs and called, "I shall have to go." Almost immediately he heard her coming down. She had on her best dress of black voile, and her hair was tidy but still damp. She looked at him, and, in spite of herself, smiled. "I don't like you in those clothes," she said. "Do I look a sight?" he answered. They were shy of one another. "I'll make you some tea," she said. "No, I must go." "Must you?" And she looked at him with the wide, strained, doubtful eyes. And again, from the pain of his breast, he knew how he loved her. He went and bent to kiss her, gently, passionately, with his heart's painful kiss. "And my hair smells so horrible," she murmured in distraction, "and I'm so awful. I'm so awful. Oh, no, I'm too awful." And she broke into bitter, heartbroken sobbing. "You can't want to love me. I'm horrible." "Don't be silly. Don't be silly," he said, trying to comfort her, kissing her, holding her in his arms. "I want you. I want to marry you. We're going to be married. Quickly. Quickly. Tomorrow, if I can." But she only sobbed terribly and cried, "I feel awful. I feel awful. I feel I'm horrible to you." "No, I want you. I want you," was all he answered, blindly, with that terrible intonation which frightened her almost more than her horror lest he should not want her. End of The Horse Dealer's Daughter by D.H. Lawrence.